If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1. Suk, how do you intend to repay what you owe me? On a small path just outside Siraidii, not far from Shin'ō Academy, Kaelith Yurei extended his trembling hand, pointing accusingly at the young man in front of him, who was dressed in the blue and white school uniform. The boy, called Suk, sighed. Kaelith, I told you before we came out here, the distance between Shin and the 1st Division barracks is too far. Getting you there in under a minute is simply impossible. At our pace, it would take us at least 2 to 3 hours to reach the 1st Division barracks. And even if we did get there, there's no way they'd let us in. The 1st Division is the heart of the Gotei 13 and wouldn't allow students just to wander in freely. Hearing this, Kaelith Yurei sighed and slumped to the ground, looking utterly defeated. This is the Soul Society, the world of Bleach, or as it's commonly known, Shinigami. 6 months ago, Kaelith was transported into this world, assuming the identity of a new student at Shin'ō Academy, under the name Kaelith Yurei. And the boy standing next to him? In the world of Bleach, he's a rather famous figure known as Sōsuke Aizen. At first, when Kaelith discovered he was in the same class as the legendary Aizen, he was terrified, always on guard around him, fearing that even a minor slip might catch the attention of this future mastermind. But, after a few months, Kaelith realized that this young Aizen wasn't as formidable as he'd imagined. When it came to wielding a Zanpakuto, exorcising hollows, or even Shunpo, Aizen was only slightly better than Kaelith in Kid. In other areas, they were more or less on the same level. After testing his observations multiple times, Kaelith became increasingly convinced that while Aizen would one day grow overwhelmingly powerful, for now, as a student, he was just at an average level for a top Shin'ō Academy student. Kaelith figured that Aizen must experience some turning point after graduation, which would mark the start of his rapid ascent to power. By then, this big boss version of Aizen would officially step onto the stage of history. And as for Kaelith, he'd likely be little more than a forgotten former classmate by then. Kaelith didn't particularly care about that. After all, in this era without video games or the internet, he had no interest in world domination either. His goal was simple: to earn decent marks at Shin, join the Gotei 13, secure a seated officer position, and live the life of a Soul Society warrior, feeding off the blood and sweat of Rukonga's residents. That was, until 2 minutes ago, when his life's ambitions suddenly changed. The reason? His cheat ability had finally arrived. Training link system activating. Activation successful. In 1 minute, the system will bind to the individual within a 500-meter radius with the highest training potential. Once bound, every time this individual's strength increases, if the host's strength is lower, it will automatically synchronize to match the individual's level. Countdown, 59, 58. Hearing the system's prompt, Kaelith, who was in the middle of class, jolted up as if struck by lightning. Under the astonished gaze of his teacher and classmates, he quickly said, "Sorry, sensei, I have a stomachache." Then, he grabbed the person sitting behind him, Aizen. Suk, quick, take me to the infirmary." Not giving the teacher time to react, Kaelith bolted out of the room with Aizen in tow. As they ran, Kaelith Yurei spoke urgently, "Suk, hurry, take me to the 1st Division barracks. This is a lifelong request from your best friend." The moment the system countdown had begun, Kaelith made up his mind he had to bind to Genrisai Shigakuni Yamamoto. If he could synchronize with Yamamoto, he'd be invincible in the Soul Society from that day forward. T/N if only life was that easy. No matter who it was, Aizen, the young version, Ichigo Kurosaki or Jinrei Kukaki, he'd cut down anyone who dared to stand in his way. But then, he was betrayed by his supposed best friend. Aizen, this unreliable guy, couldn't even take him to the 1st Division barracks. They hadn't even made it a kilometer before the system activated on its own and bound him to Aizen instead. Kaelith was devastated. Though he knew that Aizen would one day become powerful, who could say when that would happen? Shinigami had such long lifespans. If Aizen didn't start getting stronger for another 100 or 200 years, wouldn't that mean he'd miss out on a century or two of effortlessly coasting to power? It felt like a serious loss. Watching Kaelith's grief-stricken face, Aizen shook his head helplessly. "I don't know what you were planning, but since it didn't work, let's go back to class. If Kinoshita-sensei finds out you faked an illness to skip class, he'll probably break your legs." As he spoke, Aizen extended a hand to the seated Kaelith Yurei. Kaelith grabbed Aizen's hand and stood up. Looking at the brown-haired boy in front of him, Kaelith solemnly placed his hand on Aizen's shoulder and gave it a heavy pat. Suk, you have to work hard at your training. Become a man who stands above all others, unmatched by anyone. And, just to make sure, he emphasized again, you have to work hard. Aizen. Seeing the serious look on Kaelith's face, Aizen suddenly wondered if his friend might actually be unwell. After a short while, they returned to Shin'ō Academy. The final class of the morning had already ended, and Kinoshita-sensei had left the classroom. As they walked in, a young man with gentle features, long black hair, and an almost feminine grace stood up and approached them. Kaelith, you're back so soon. Are you feeling all right? Kaelith waved his hand dismissively and sighed. My body's fine, but my spirit has suffered a serious blow. The gentle young man was about to say something when suddenly a mocking voice came from the side. Kaelith, instead of worrying about your spiritual wounds, you should be more concerned about your legs. Kinoshita-sensei left for the infirmary earlier. Imagine what he'll think if he finds out you're not there. I can't even guess what he'll do. Hearing this, Kaelith's face took on a look of horror. If Kinoshita-sensei discovered he'd skipped class on purpose, the consequences would be terrible. He wasn't the strongest in the Soul Society yet, he couldn't afford to get into trouble now. As Kaelith debated whether he should take a few days off to avoid the teacher, the dark-haired man laughed and shook his head. Don't listen to Sōsuke. Kinoshita-sensei went to the Kendo hall. Kaelith glared at his classmate, who was lounging on the desk nearby. So that's it, hey, Sōsuke? Messing with your own friend, are we? Don't run after school, I'll make sure you regret it. Sōsuke Yamamoto clicked his tongue and turned to the black-haired boy. Kokaki-sama, don't side with him like that. Don't listen to him, Kokaki-san, Kaelith said, crossing his arms. If guys like Sōsuke are left unchecked, they'll end up a menace to the Soul Society. Either they'll be imprisoned for life or burned at the Skyaku. By stepping in now, we're saving him from himself. He should be thanking us. Sōsuke snorted. I'm the Soul Society's menace? Oh, please, Kaelith. Have you forgotten how you described the Central 46 before? What did I say? I'm completely loyal to the Central 46. If they tell me to go east, I'd never even think of heading west. At that, Sōsuke widened his eyes, as if stunned by Kaelith's shamelessness, momentarily left speechless. The dark-haired Kokaki, standing nearby, finally found a chance to join the conversation. Raising his hand, he said, Kaelith, you can just call me Kokaki or Shun. This Lord Kokaki thing is just weird. All right, Teacher Shun, I got it, Kaelith replied seriously with a nod. Watching his quirky classmates, Aizen couldn't help but sigh. Chapter 2. After chatting casually for a while, the three of them made their way to the cafeteria. Kaelith Yurei bought 2 rice balls, a bowl of miso soup, and a plate of pickled radish, placing them on his tray. Sōsuke Yamamoto and Sōsuke Aizen quickly chose their lunches as well. The three of them carried their trays to a corner table in the cafeteria and sat down together. Shun Kokaki had already settled in at the table. In front of him lay several beautifully arranged food boxes filled with various delicacies. Unlike Kaelith and the others, who were more like commoners, Shun was a true noble heir to the Kokaki family, receiving meals delivered to him every day at Shin'ō Academy. By the way, years later, he would have a son who became somewhat famous. His name would be Byakuya Kokaki. Seeing the lavish lunch in front of Shun, Kaelith Yurei couldn't help but grimace. Such decadence! How can you, as a warrior, remain resilient in a world full of temptations when you indulge in such fine food every day? Shun Kokaki remained expressionless. If you want to eat something, just take it. You truly have a great warrior spirit. Kaelith's grimace instantly vanished, replaced with a beaming smile as he showered Shun with compliments. In a flash, he snatched an untainted piece of grilled fish and some fried eggs from Shun's box using a pair of chopsticks. Shun shook his head with a smile and turned his attention to Sōsuke Aizen, who was sitting next to Kaelith. Seeing the simple chajuk, tea rice, in Aizen's bowl, Shun shook his head and said, Sōsuke, you should eat some of this too. With your talent, it's hard to grow strong on such little food. As he spoke, he picked up some fish from his box, intending to offer it to Aizen. But Aizen politely bowed his head and pulled his bowl back. Thank you, but I don't need it. I've already. Before he could finish, Kaelith interjected, Sōsuke, why are you being polite? To someone like him, money and dirt are basically the same thing. If you really feel bad about it, just help him out if he runs into any trouble in the future. As he spoke, Kaelith took the fish from Shun and placed it in Aizen's bowl. Looking at the fish in his bowl, Aizen showed a somewhat helpless expression. Due to his unique talent, he absorbed spiritual particles in the air at a rate far exceeding that of normal Shinigami, so he didn't really need to rely on food for energy. In fact, he could go for years without eating in the vicinity of Siraidii without any adverse effects. T/Ni Tuft, he was a Vergay. Is he hiding something? The reason he came to the cafeteria daily was merely to avoid drawing attention. However, these were thoughts he could never voice. Lifting his head, he looked at Kaelith Yurei and Shun Kokaki. Under their gaze, he gently nodded. Thank you. Kaelith Yurei grinned widely and said, eat more, train harder, and strive to live up to the expectations that Shun and I have for you. Aizen met his gaze calmly, suddenly curious about how Kaelith would react if he revealed his true strength right now. Perhaps it would be quite interesting. Imagining this scene, Aizen slightly curled his lips. After finishing their meal, Shun Kokaki set down his chopsticks. Kaelith, Sōsuke, I'm planning to apply for early graduation at the end of this year. Upon hearing this, the three of them were momentarily stunned. Yamamoto, slightly surprised, asked, just after 1 year. Shin'ō Academy was originally a 6-year program, but students were allowed to apply for early graduation. Many exceptionally talented Shinigami would apply for early graduation in their 3rd or 4th year to join the Gotei 13 and hone their skills. However, it was rare to see someone like Shun wanting to graduate after just 1 year. Shun nodded. Yeah, it's a bit early, but the current situation in the Soul Society doesn't allow for any more delay. I need to graduate early and join the 6th division to contribute to the Kokaki family. That's the least I can do to repay my father's training. Kaelith Yurei suddenly seemed to remember something. He turned to Shun and said, isn't your brother-in-law quite powerful? I heard he's unstoppable on the battlefield, causing the rebels to tremble at his name. With him helping your father, dealing with the rebels should be easy, right? Shun Kokaki forced a smile and said, my brother-in-law is indeed powerful, but... He shook his head, stopping himself. Not only was his brother-in-law in a special situation that wasn't suitable for public discussion, but he also didn't want to speak ill of others behind their backs. Seeing that Shun didn't want to elaborate, Kaelith didn't press further. The first class in the afternoon was Kenjutsu, the art of the sword. Kinoshita held a bamboo sword, demonstrating movements while loudly explaining the key points of each action to the students. Kaelith and the others sat in a row on the wooden floor, kneeling with their bamboo swords placed in front of them. Sōsuke Yamamoto leaned closer and whispered, Kaelith, did you hear? In a few days, a big shot is coming to Shin to be a guest lecturer for us. A big shot? How big? Kaelith asked quietly, keeping his gaze straight ahead. I heard it's a captain from the Gotei 13. Upon hearing this, Kaelith glanced at Sōsuke in surprise. It wasn't unusual for a captain from the Gotei 13 to teach at Shin, but they usually only taught the 4th years and above. What did they, as first years, do to deserve a captain's lesson? It couldn't be that a newly appointed captain was just coming to gain experience from them, could it? It seemed that Kinoshita overheard their conversation, as he stopped his demonstration and looked over. Upon seeing Kaelith, he paused for a moment, then suddenly seemed to remember something, his eyebrows shooting up. Kaelith Yurei. You brat, get out here. Without hesitation, Kaelith replied, Teacher, it was Sōsuke who called for me. I was just trying to tell him to be quiet and pay attention in class. Sōsuke Yamamoto was taken aback. Hey! Before he could react to Kaelith, Kinoshita shouted angrily, who told you to say that? Before class started, I went to the infirmary, and they said you never showed up. You little brat! You dare skip my class? I'll break your legs. Perfect. You can come up here to help me demonstrate. Today's Kenjutsu lesson will use you as the teaching material. Hearing Kinoshita's words, Kaelith's expression stiffened. Sōsuke Yamamoto grinned widely, showing his excitement. Go on, Kaelith. Don't keep everyone waiting. In the cheerful atmosphere, Kaelith made a clicking sound with his tongue, picked up his bamboo sword, and walked toward the front of the dojo. Shun Kokaki gave him an encouraging smile. Aizen showed no particular reaction. He had no interest in Kinoshita's sword techniques and even less in the teacher's little theatrical punishment of students. After several days of training, his strength was on the verge of another breakthrough. Since there wasn't much else to do, he simply closed his eyes, began to channel his spiritual pressure, and prepared to break through to the next level. Chapter 3. With the students watching intently, Kaelith Yurei walked up and stopped in front of Kinoshita. Facing his teacher, Kaelith suddenly bowed. "Sensei, I was wrong." Kinoshita. Before he could respond, Kaelith straightened up, grinning. "I've admitted my mistake, Sensei. Can we just forget this and let me return to class?" Kinoshita's eye twitched as he shook his head. "No. Oh, alright then. Maybe I wasn't wrong after all." Kinoshita's face tightened, feeling his blood pressure surge with irritation. "Bold, aren't you? Trying to mess with me right before a sparring session. You're the first to pull that stunt." With a huff, Kinoshita crouched into a stance, raising his Shin'ō, bamboo sword, and signaling readiness. Kaelith mirrored the stance, gripping his own Shin'ō. After a tense moment, Kinoshita suddenly advanced. With a swift step forward, he closed the gap, aiming an upward slash. Thwack! Kaelith raised his Shin'ō to block, and the two bamboo swords met with a loud smack. Feeling the weight behind Kinoshita's swing, Kaelith winced. "Nope, I give up." "Giving up is not an option," Kinoshita snapped. As Kaelith's homeroom teacher, Kinoshita knew him well and didn't hesitate to refuse his surrender. Tightening his grip, Kinoshita twisted his Shin'ō along the length of Kaelith's sword, cutting sharply toward his ribs. Kaelith retreated, blocking with quick, angled deflections. For a moment, the dojo filled with the relentless clash of bamboo, echoing like heavy raindrops drumming on the roof. Unlike conventional Kendo, Zanjutsu, the swordsmanship of the Shinigami is entirely combat-oriented, with each strike aimed to disable or defeat an opponent. During sparring sessions, minor injuries were common. The academy infirmary was always prepared for an influx after every practical class. With Kinoshita's skill, serious accidents were rare. But today, he was determined to leave an impression on Kaelith, one that would make him think twice before skipping future lessons. Kinoshita's expression softened for a moment as Kaelith successfully blocked another series of attacks. Despite his antics, Kaelith had trained seriously. His discipline was, in fact, one of his redeeming qualities. Kinoshita smirked to himself. In that case, perhaps he could add a touch of Ryutsu, just to reinforce the lesson. Kaelith, observing Kinoshita's posture, was waiting for an opening when he suddenly sensed an intense surge of spiritual energy emanating from his teacher. "What the? Isn't this a bit much?" Kaelith muttered. "This is Ryutsu at a Shinigami's level. How is this fair?" Kinoshita chuckled. "Brace yourself. If you think this is unfair, consider it punishment." Without waiting for a reply, Kinoshita swung down again. Kaelith held his Shin'ō horizontally to block, feeling his arms strain against the overwhelming weight pressing down. The crushing force felt like a mountain collapsing onto him. In that instant, he fully understood why it was called spiritual pressure. This weight felt all-consuming. With a fierce effort, Kaelith deflected the blow, his arms tingling with numbness. Kinoshita observed Kaelith's stunned face and grinned in satisfaction. "So now you understand your teacher's strength, do you? Remember this next time you think about skipping class." Kinoshita swung his Shin'ō again, advancing relentlessly. Kaelith had no choice but to keep blocking, feeling luck abandon him with each step. If he relaxed for even a moment, he'd be in for a bruising. The students watching had grown quiet, their initial amusement fading as they noticed the intensity of the sparring. Shun Kukaki furrowed his brows, recognizing the serious nature of Kinoshita's strikes. As a member of the Kukaki clan, he knew of their teacher's background, a former 4th seat of the 13th Division who had faced hollows in countless battles before an injury brought him to teach at Shin'ō Academy. If Kinoshita's old injury flared and he lost control, this session could get dangerous. Kukaki slowly stood, prepared to intervene if necessary. Meanwhile, Kaelith continued to backpedal. "Hey, sensei. I was just holding back for your sake. If you keep this up, I'll have to start fighting for real." Kinoshita laughed. "Oh? Then go ahead and counter. Show me what you've got." Kaelith's eyes narrowed. "All right, watch closely." Secretly, Kaelith planned to escape the moment Kinoshita paused. But Kinoshita, seeming to anticipate this, pressed forward without stopping, preparing to deliver a strike Kaelith wouldn't soon forget. Seeing no other option, Kaelith braced himself, lifting his Shin'ō defensively. Meanwhile, Aizen, who had been watching quietly from nearby, exhaled softly. While the other students focused on this low-level skirmish, Aizen had already powered up significantly through his own disciplined training. Kaelith Yurei might boast about his self-discipline, but Aizen, who was steadily growing in strength without the need for showy declarations, knew he embodied that quality far better. Just as Aizen turned his attention back to Kaelith's struggle, a cascade of notifications filled Kaelith's mind. Detected binding target. Aizen's has increased in strength. Synchronizing training progress. Synchronization complete. Your Ryutsu has increased. Current level, 13. Your Ryutsu has increased. Current level, 12. Your Ryutsu. Your understanding of Bakud has improved. You have mastered Bakud number 39, in Kosen. Your understanding of Bakud has improved. You have mastered Bakud number 39, in Kosen, no incantation. Your understanding of Bakud. You have mastered Bakud number 81, Dank. Your understanding of Had has improved. You have mastered Had number 32, Kaizen. Your understanding of Had has improved. You have mastered Had number 32, Kaizen, no incantation. Your understanding. You have mastered Had number 73, Srinskatsui. Your understanding of Zanjutsu has improved, T/N, swordsmanship. Your understanding of Shunpo has improved, flash step. Your understanding of Hakuta has improved, hand-to-hand combat. Notifications flashed by at a dizzying pace. Though the flood of prompts felt overwhelming, his mind processed the new information instantly, as if no time had passed for those around him. Kaelith had never suspected that Aizen, whom he considered an ordinary peer, had mastered so many advanced kid spells. And his Ryutsu, it was immense. Wait, what was his own Ryutsu level now? Before he could even check, an overwhelming surge of spiritual pressure erupted from his body. It was so sudden and uncontrollable that it burst forth all at once, filling the dojo. Kinoshita, mid-swing, froze, his expression locked in shock as he witnessed the torrent of spiritual energy that erupted from Kaelith. Boom! Chapter 4. A golden column of spiritual pressure shot into the sky, instantly tearing through the dojo ceiling and soaring into the clouds. Many students in the dojo, caught off guard, were blown away by the residual wave of spiritual pressure, tumbling like a pile of overturned dumplings, crashing against the walls and rolling on the floor. Kinoshita, facing the impact directly, was smashed through the wall behind him and fell outside the dojo. Kokaki Shun extended his hand. Bakud number 39. Inkan. A circular wall of spiritual energy rapidly condensed into shape. Although it wasn't as comprehensive in defense as Bakud number 81, Danku, it blocked most of the impact, protecting Sōsuke Yamada and Aizen behind him. Looking at the center of the light column, Kokaki Shun's eyes filled with astonishment. As a noble scion, he had been exposed to powerful Shinigami since childhood and received elite education within his family even before attending the Shinigami Academy. Thus, he was 100% certain that the spiritual pressure radiating from Kaelith Yurei had already reached the level of a vice-captain of the Gotei 13. His first thought was to feel happy for his friend. But then, Kokaki Shun became confused. Kaelith Yurei had enrolled as a commoner and had been an ordinary soul just 6 months ago. On ordinary days, the strength he exhibited was roughly at the level of a trainee Shinigami. To be fair, that speed was already quite astonishing. Even among noble descendants with bloodline advantages, only a small number could achieve that. And now, Kaelith Yurei had suddenly proven through his actions that his usual strength had all been a facade, his true power had reached the level of a vice-captain. Kokaki Shun couldn't help but question whether he was dreaming. All the students who hadn't been blown away were dumbfounded, looking as if they couldn't believe what was happening. Behind Kokaki Shun, Sōsuke Yamada instinctively pinched his arm, wincing in pain. Aizen sat on the ground, hands resting on his knees, looking as if he had been struck by a binding spell, eyes wide as he stared at Kaelith Yurei. As a Shinigami from a commoner background, he hadn't known how to cultivate spiritual pressure before attending the academy. Although he had extraordinary talent, his spiritual pressure had been at the level of a regular seated officer when he first enrolled. In just half a year, he had transformed from a complete novice learning to cultivate spiritual pressure into a powerhouse at the vice-captain level. Although no one knew it, he felt a deep pride in this achievement. In the library of the Shin'ō Academy, he had browsed through records of outstanding students from past generations and could confirm that no one had ever reached his level of training speed before. Sometimes, Aizen even felt that he might be a being of a different level from Shinigami, merely appearing as a Shinigami for some reason. However, just as he was feeling so proud, a seemingly ordinary friend gave him a huge surprise. Right before his eyes, the spiritual pressure emanating from Kaelith Yurei was absolutely on par with his own. In an instant, Aizen's feelings became incredibly complex. He couldn't even determine what he was feeling at that moment. Should he feel ashamed of his long-held self-satisfaction? Should he feel happy that his friend possessed such powerful strength? Should he feel astonished that Kaelith Yurei had hidden this capability, clearly possessing such strength yet never showcasing it? After a few seconds of thought, Aizen took a deep breath. All of these thoughts indeed existed in his mind. But, more than that, there was an inexplicable sense of reassurance. So, it turned out, he was not a strange existence. Apart from himself, there were others in the world who could grow at such an astonishing rate. Aizen took a deep breath, calming the rising joy in his heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt an emotion called expectation. He anticipated how he would grow, how Kaelith Yurei would grow. He wondered who among them would turn out to be the more special one. T/N The worst timeline has been unlocked. Suddenly, a scene resurfaced in his mind. That morning, outside the school, Kaelith Yurei had looked at him earnestly. Sōsuke, you must work hard to cultivate your powers and become a man who stands above others, invincible in the world. At the time, he dismissed Kaelith Yurei's behavior as nothing more than another of his usual eccentricities. Now, he suddenly understood. So that's it. Kaelith, perhaps, had vaguely sensed that Aizen was hiding his true strength. Just as he was looking forward to Kaelith's growth, Kaelith was also looking forward to his. If things went as expected, Kaelith Yurei was probably feeling as lost as Aizen was about this unnatural power, uncertain of what kind of existence he was. With this thought, Aizen couldn't help but smirk. If that was the case, he had to hide his strength even better. Using Kaelith Yurei's words, seeing others anxious and uncomfortable was also a kind of unique pleasure, wasn't it? In contrast to Aizen, Kinoshida's mood was not so good. Outside the dojo, he was covered in dirt, lying on the ground like a big mole. Who am I? Where is this? What am I doing? The bamboo sword in his hand had somehow broken into 2 pieces. His clothes were tattered and torn from the impact of the spiritual pressure, making him look as if he were dressed in rags. His entire body was racked with pain. He figured he had probably broken a few bones from that last blow. Looking at the golden pillar of spiritual pressure shooting into the sky, Kinoshita couldn't help but feel frustrated. Kaelith Yurei had actually hidden such a terrifying trump card. That guy's spiritual pressure was at the vice-captain level. How on earth had he cultivated that? Even the so-called genius who was said to be a once-in-a-century talent in the Soul Society, Kukaki Hisaka, who had entered the Kukaki family as a commoner, had never been this exaggerated when he started. Using his hands to push himself up from the ground, Kinoshita struggled to stand, peering through the large hole he had just crashed through to look inside the dojo. Seeing Kaelith Yurei standing within the pillar of spiritual pressure, excitement gradually filled his eyes. A genius, this was a true genius. Though he didn't understand why this kid had been hiding his strength all this time, it didn't matter anymore. After so many years of teaching at Shin'ō Academy, he had finally encountered a genius. One day in the future, when this kid became a pillar of the Soul Society, everyone would know that he was this kid's teacher. Thinking of this, Kinoshita couldn't help but grin foolishly. Under everyone's gaze, Kaelith Yurei desperately suppressed his spiritual pressure and finally managed to retract it completely. After taking a few deep breaths, he turned to look at Aizen. This guy was incredibly good at hiding his strength. Clearly, the power he usually displayed was only at the level of a trainee Shinigami, yet his true strength was already at the level of a vice-captain. If it weren't for the synchronization of their powers, he might not have realized it even by graduation. So this is Aizen Sōsuke, terrifying indeed. Just thinking about how he had dared to underestimate the legendary Aizen made Kaelith Yurei's face flush with embarrassment. Seeing Kaelith Yurei look at him, Aizen smiled slightly. This guy must be silently asking himself whether his strength could rival his own. He wouldn't respond, wanting to see how anxious Kaelith would get. When Aizen smiled at him, Kaelith Yurei felt a bit moved. Fortunately, the younger Aizen wasn't so devious and didn't laugh at him for only realizing his strength now. He really was a good guy after all. T/N Aizen is truly a good guy. Chapter 5. Kaelith, how on earth did you do it? On the way to the dormitory, Sōsuke Yamamoto ran up beside Kaelith, his excitement evident. Kaelith pointed at Aizen. He taught me. Sōsuke paused for a moment, then turned to look at Aizen. Aizen wore a confused expression as if he had no idea what was happening. Sōsuke narrowed his eyes skeptically. Suddenly, he reached out and grabbed Aizen's wrist. After closing his eyes and sensing the intensity of Aizen's spiritual pressure, he opened his eyes and cast a disdainful look at Kaelith. Kaelith, don't distract me. Although Aizen's spiritual pressure is quite high and can rival that of the noble Kukaki family, it's still leagues behind yours. Kaelith chuckled softly. Foolish Sōsuke had been deceived by Aizen's feigned appearance. Perhaps only someone as wise and perceptive as himself could see through Aizen's true nature. With this thought, Kaelith sharply severed the ties to his previous self from before today. Shun had his hands tucked into his sleeves, walking alongside the three of them. He was equally curious about what had transpired with Kaelith, but just as Kaelith wouldn't pry into his family matters, he wouldn't casually ask about Kaelith's. After a moment's thought, he spoke up, Yurei, you need to be careful in the days to come. Careful about what? Kaelith asked, puzzled. Shun replied seriously, the Soul Society is currently in turmoil, with various factions eager to expand their power and increase their influence. Someone like you, possessing immense strength and limitless potential, is precisely the kind of target they seek. Those elders won't consider your well-being. Once you accept their olive branch, you'll become a blade in their hands. The fate of that blade, and what it ultimately becomes, is of no concern to the nobles. Once you reach that point, your originally bright future could fall into darkness. Moreover, once you choose to join a faction, other factions will inevitably plot against you to prevent you from becoming an obstacle in the future. The conflicts between nobles are filled with treachery. By the end of his words, Shun's gaze reflected helplessness. In reality, it wasn't just commoners like Kaelith Yurei, even he, a scion of one of the four great noble families, would still be swept into this enormous whirlpool. He was reluctant to accept this reality, yet he had no room for choice. Because of this, he hoped his friends could lead a more peaceful life, unlike him who didn't have a choice. After some contemplation, he seemed to have made a resolution. Yurei, if you trust me, you could superficially join the Kukaki family. With the Kukaki family's name, other families naturally wouldn't come to harass you. As for those who wish to harm you, they would also have to consider the power of the Kukaki family. Don't worry, I'll talk to my father and assure him that you are only joining in name and that we won't make you do anything. Fearing that Kaelith might misunderstand, he quickly explained. Looking at Shun, Kaelith felt a sense of gratitude. He reached out and patted Shun on the shoulder. So Jun, you're truly a good person. I just want to protect those around me as much as I can. I'm not as noble as you say. Shun gently shook his head. Kaelith Yurei pondered for a moment. To be fair, Shun's suggestion was indeed very tempting. As he said, the current Soul Society was in turmoil. If he continued to operate at his previous level, it might not matter much. Now, thanks to Aizen, what happened today would surely spread to the ears of the major nobles soon, and even if he wanted to hide, he couldn't. Rather than being harassed by various nobles, it might be better to join the Kukaki family, at least he would have acquaintances there. But, if he joined, could he really remain an outsider, as Shun imagined? Not to mention whether Kukaki Jinrei would accept him, he himself couldn't do something so selfish as to take advantage without contributing. T/N Kukaki Jinrei, current family head, grandfather of Byakuya Kukaki. Under Shun's watchful gaze, he nodded and said, I'll think it over carefully. Upon hearing this, Shun sighed. From Kaelith's response, it was clear he was politely declining. However, since Shun couldn't insist more, there was little more he could persuade him about. All he could do was help as much as possible depending on how things developed. The dormitories of the Shin Academy housed 4 students per room. Kaelith Yurei, Aizen, and 2 other classmates shared one room. Sōsuke Yamamoto lived next door. As for Shun, being a noble, he naturally had a single room. Kaelith had expressed his envy numerous times over this. After returning to the dormitory, Kaelith assured Sōsuke Yamamoto that he would find time to practice with him, successfully dismissing him. Sitting on his bed, he closed his eyes and began to digest the gains he had synced with Aizen. As a reincarnator with a unique advantage, the system's abilities were indeed reliable. All the skills synced from Aizen felt as if they were innate, inscribed in his very being, ready to be used whenever he wanted. However, simply learning the techniques did not make one strong. It was like playing a competitive game, for a character built from scratch, every skill had its purpose, and when to use it, and how to string combos together was clear in his mind. If someone had never engaged with the game before and just bought a powerful account, even with all the skills available, they could only unleash a small portion of its power, leading to a tremendous waste. As a self-disciplined person, Kaelith Yurei certainly couldn't accept such a situation. Watching Kaelith begin to practice as soon as he returned, Aizen felt a sense of pressure. Without saying a word, he also removed his shoes and socks, sitting on his bed to begin gathering his spiritual pressure. Before long, the two roommates returned to the dormitory. When the two entered the room, they initially wanted to invite Kaelith and Aizen to join them for dinner, but upon seeing the two in their current state, they quickly closed their mouths. They exchanged glances, their expressions somewhat complicated. While everyone else was playing, some were secretly practicing. This world was truly difficult. After spending about 2 hours, Kaelith Yurei finally absorbed most of the footwork techniques he had synced from Aizen. To understand it more profoundly and remember it more solidly, mere mental visualization wasn't enough, practical application was necessary. He would have the opportunity to practice against Shun, that guy, being a noble, should have insights into footwork, right? Glancing at the rolled-up blanket on the adjacent bed, Kaelith decided against calling him over. After all, the harder Aizen trained, the more at ease he could be with slacking off. With this pleasant thought, Kaelith left the dormitory, ready to head to the cafeteria for a meal. However, just as he stepped outside, he spotted their homeroom teacher, Kinoshita. Seeing Kaelith, Kinoshita's eyes lit up, and he quickly hurried over. "Kaelith, come with me." "Wait a second. Kinoshita-sensei, do you even know where I'm going?" "Just following you isn't enough," Kaelith said, taking a cautious step back. Could Kinoshita be a messenger for some noble? Seemingly guessing his thoughts, Kinoshita rolled his eyes. "Kid, what do you think of me? Just come along quickly. Captain Yamamoto has summoned you." Kaelith. Chapter 6. Siraidii, 1st Division Barracks. Kinoshita stood at the front gate, explaining his purpose to the guarding Shinigami. Meanwhile, Kaelith Yurei looked around with curiosity. Although he had been in the world of Soul Reapers for over half a year now, this was his first time entering the inner parts of Siraidii. Everywhere he looked, Shinigami stood at their posts, vigilant. Occasionally, a few messengers from the Onmitsukid, wearing wide-brimmed hats that obscured their faces, would appear suddenly and then vanish just as quickly. T/N Stealth Force Onmitsukid was Yoryuki's division. It is another branch of the military, not 2nd Division that Yoryuki also led. Kaelith noticed that some Shinigami occasionally stole curious glances at him. The reason for their curiosity was likely his blue and white Shin'ō Academy uniform. Or maybe, word had already spread about the incident that happened this afternoon. As he pondered, Kinoshita returned. "Let's go, Yurei." The two walked through the 1st Division's gate, crossed the courtyard, and entered the barracks. At the entrance of a room, Kinoshita removed his shoes and stepped onto the raised wooden floor. Kaelith did the same, following his example. Kinoshita cleared his throat. "Captain Commander, sir. I am Kinoshita Nikio, an instructor at the Shin Spirit Arts Academy. As per your instructions, I have brought the student, Kaelith Yurei." After he spoke, he stood straight, a bit tense, waiting for a response from within. Kaelith looked at him, a bit surprised. "This is the first time I've heard your name, Kinoshita-sensei." Kinoshita blinked, surprised. "Nonsense, I introduced myself on the first day you entered the academy." "Wait, were you spacing out in class on your first day?" Kinoshita felt his blood pressure rise. If not for the setting, he would have wanted to give him a good talking to. But no, this kid had already reached the level of a vice-captain, and with his own injured body, he wasn't sure he could take him on. Perhaps he could catch him off guard during class one day, and give him a good whack? The thought brought a glint to Kinoshita's eyes. As expected from an instructor at the Shin Spirit Arts Academy, he quickly came up with a brilliant plan. While he was contemplating how to handle Kaelith, a voice sounded from inside. "Enter." Kinoshita quickly bowed his head, stepping forward in small, careful strides to the door, and slid it open. "Apologies for the intrusion." Through the open door, Kaelith looked inside. It was a small room, clean and orderly. On one side of the wall hung several bamboo practice swords. On the other side was a desk, arranged with brushes, ink, and paper. Above the desk, a piece of calligraphy was displayed on the wall, but Kaelith, lacking an artistic eye, couldn't decipher it. In the center of the room stood a figure, silent and still. With his back to the door, Kaelith could only see the bald head and the flowing white Haori. The black diamond symbol on the Haori's back was the kanji for one. Without a doubt, this was Yamamoto Genrisai Ishigakuni, Captain Commander of the Gotei 13 and leader of the 1st Division. Upon seeing the elder, Kinoshita immediately knelt on one knee. "Captain Commander, sir." Noticing Kaelith Yurei standing there without much reaction, Kinoshita quickly whispered, "Yurei, what are you standing there for? Hurry and." Before he could finish, Yamamoto, standing with his back to them, spoke suddenly. "Kaelith Yurei, would you be willing to graduate early and join the Gotei 13? Hearing this, Kinoshita was slightly stunned. Why would the Captain Commander ask such a question? Kaelith had only been in the academy for half a year. While he was indeed strong, it was still a bit early to graduate. After all, strength alone doesn't mean one knows everything. There are techniques, knowledge on fighting hollows, Soul Society's history, and the responsibilities of a Soul Reaper, all things learned at the Shin Academy. Graduating early would leave him with gaps in his education. Joining the Gotei 13 now would be like diving in blind. Unless, of course, he were a nobleman, like Shun'ō, who received an elite education from a young age, knowing all that was necessary and more. In that case, he could graduate whenever he wanted. While Kinoshita was lost in thought, Yamamoto continued, "If you are willing to join the Gotei 13 now, I can personally arrange for you to enter the 1st Division as an officer." Kinoshita's eyes widened. After a brief shock, he looked at Kaelith with excitement, giving him a look to agree. The 1st Division, that was the Captain Commander's division, and joining it would be a huge advantage for Kaelith Yurei's future. Moreover, joining directly as an officer wasn't an opportunity just any Soul Reaper could get. However, under Kinoshita's eager gaze, Kaelith frowned slightly. After a few moments of thought, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Captain Commander, but I don't really want to join the 1st Division." Hearing Kaelith's response, Yamamoto slowly turned around. His narrowed eyes opened slightly, fixing on Kaelith. He spoke slowly, "Your reason?" Kinoshita, though not directly in Yamamoto's gaze, felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He wanted to help explain on behalf of Kaelith but found his throat tight, barely able to make a sound. Kaelith showed a somewhat troubled expression. "Captain Commander, if I speak honestly, you won't be upset, right?" Yamamoto fell silent at this. It seemed the thing he hoped to avoid was happening. He suspected Kaelith Yurei had already been drawn in by one of the noble clans, intending to evade the 1st Division's recruitment. As the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13, Yamamoto did not get involved in nobles' conflicts and certainly didn't foster his own faction. His only reason for recruiting Kaelith was to prevent a talented individual from being used as a pawn. But then, which clan could be trying to pull him in? The Kukaki clan? The Shine clan? Or perhaps, the Tsuneyashiro clan? If it were the Kukaki family, he might be able to accept that. After all, Jinrei Kukaki was an old friend and a steady, insightful man. Kaelith Yurei wouldn't fare too badly with him. But if it were the Tsuneyashiro clan, then Kaelith's future might be in jeopardy. Yamamoto nodded slightly. "Speak freely." At that moment, Kinoshita could feel the room's atmosphere turn icy. He swallowed nervously, fearing Kaelith might say something offensive and anger the Captain Commander. Under Kinoshita's anxious gaze, Kaelith spoke sincerely, "I've studied the different divisions while in school. Although the 1st Division has relatively light work and might be a place to relax, it's mostly filled with older Soul Reapers, and there aren't many cute girls. T/N brew. Good man. I was hoping that after graduation, I could join a division with more girls, like the 4th or 13th Division." As he spoke, he seemed to remember something, looking at Yamamoto with hopeful eyes. "Captain Commander, you have the authority. Could you perhaps assign me to one of those divisions ahead of time? I promise I'll work hard and repay your kindness." Seeing the sudden enthusiasm in Kaelith's eyes, Yamamoto felt a chill. It triggered memories of Shunsui Kiriku's antics. Chapter 7. For a brief moment, Yamamoto felt the young man standing before him seemed to overlap with the image of Kiriko Shunsui, who had joined the ranks of the Gotei 13 centuries ago. A heart once calmed by years of practicing calligraphy was now filled with an unexpected disturbance. Having Kiriko Shunsui in the Gotei 13 had been challenging enough. The idea of another captain or even vice-captain possessing Shunsui's irreverent style. Just the thought of it filled Yamamoto with a sense of dread. Then, he caught the nuance in Kaelith Yurei's words. So, the reason you're declining is because you don't want to serve in the first division, correct? Not for any other reason. Yamamoto's voice remained calm as if the thoughts racing through his mind earlier had never existed. Exactly. That's my driving force, my life's goal, Kaelith nodded seriously. Yamamoto took a deep breath, dismissing the unwelcome memories that had surfaced. Looking at Kaelith, he asked again, do you know who holds the 13th Division captain's position? Kaelith was momentarily stunned. Jaishur Yukatake, one of the longest-serving captains in the Soul Society. Upon hearing the question, Kaelith felt a bit puzzled. Could there be more to Jaishur Yukatake's role? He had heard that in the Thousand-Year Blood War, this individual became the Soul King's right hand. Kaelith hadn't read much of the Thousand-Year Blood War manga before arriving in this world. When the arc began, he was interested and followed it for a time. However, he quickly lost interest due to the sluggish pacing and abandoned it. Thus, while he knew Jaishur Yukatake had become the Soul King's right hand, he had no idea what that entailed. Could it mean that sometimes Yukatake was required to handle unspeakable tasks? The idea was strange. As Kaelith's mind drifted to these bizarre scenarios, Yamamoto interrupted his thoughts. The Yukatake family is a minor noble house in Siraidai, closely aligned with the Gotei faction in these turbulent times. If you were to apply to the 13th Division, it would be seen as a declaration of allegiance. Kaelith Yurei, are you prepared for such an implication? At this, Kaelith finally understood the depth of Yamamoto's question. No wonder Shun'ō had warned him about the vortex of power struggles. If even someone as impartial as Yamamoto was involved, this internal conflict must be on an immense scale. Meeting Yamamoto's gaze, Kaelith Yurei shrugged. Captain Commander, if you're concerned that I might get entangled in the noble's schemes, there's no need to worry. Not to boast, but avoiding trouble is my greatest skill. Power struggles are scarier to me than Kinoshita-sensei. I'll avoid them whenever possible and have no intention of provoking anyone. Kinoshita, kneeling nearby, felt his blood pressure spike upon hearing this. Yamamoto's eyes registered a hint of surprise. He hadn't expected such an answer from this young man. After a pause, he asked, do you truly intend to remain uninvolved? Kaelith was about to nod but paused. After considering a moment, he replied, under normal circumstances, yes, I'd steer clear. But, I have a friend named Shun'ō, eldest son of the Kukaki family, someone in his position is bound to get drawn into this conflict. If the day comes when he's in danger and no one can help him, then I'll step in. Though, frankly, I doubt it'll come to that. His father is the 6th Division captain, one of the strongest Shinigami in the Soul Society. He wouldn't allow his son to be put at risk. Yamamoto studied Kaelith Yurei silently for a long moment as if lost in thought. Kaelith glanced at Kinoshita, silently asking if he could leave. Kinoshita's glare held a clear message: if the captain commander hadn't dismissed him, leaving now would ensure punishment later. Though the message was conveyed with a mere look, Kaelith could sense the underlying meaning. These barbaric ways of the Edo period were truly frustrating. Just as Kaelith wondered if Yamamoto had drifted into silence, the captain commander spoke again. Kaelith Yurei, from now on, report to the 1st Division headquarters once a week. I will personally instruct you in combat-related knowledge. The details will be communicated to you by the lieutenant of the 1st Division. Now, go. Yamamoto turned his gaze to the calligraphy on the wall, signaling the end of their conversation. Kaelith froze, then instinctively looked at Kinoshita. Kinoshita, too, wore an expression of shock. Could it be that Yamamoto intended to take Kaelith as his disciple? This realization almost made Kinoshita exclaim aloud. Since the establishment of the Shin'ō Academy, Yamamoto had only ever taught one class of students, and even then, it was more as the academy's principal, offering occasional guidance. For Yamamoto, who hadn't accepted a disciple in centuries, to personally train Kaelith Yurei. Kinoshita eagerly regarded Kaelith and had the situation allowed, he might have cheered with excitement. To his astonishment, however, Kaelith looked uneasy, as if considering whether to decline the offer. Kinoshita shuddered in disbelief. Quickly standing, he grabbed Kaelith and bowed respectfully as he led him out, backing away with measured steps. Once they were several hundred meters from Yamamoto's residence, Kinoshita, still composed, suddenly let out a frustrated sigh, dragging Kaelith along as they moved. When they were at a safer distance, Kinoshita turned and whispered fiercely, "Idiot! You were thinking of rejecting the Captain Commander's offer." Kaelith chuckled. "I wasn't going to reject it." "Not reject it? You had no written all over your face. After half a year of teaching you, I know that look." Kinoshita's anger simmered. To be personally taught by Captain Commander Yamamoto was a dream for any Shinigami. Yet this kid had the nerve to think of rejecting it. Just the idea of his student becoming Yamamoto's personal disciple filled Kinoshita with pride. Then suddenly, he froze, feeling something was amiss. If Kaelith Yurei became Yamamoto's disciple, then in the future, everyone would likely refer to him as the Captain Commander's disciple. Not as Kinoshita's. At this realization, Kinoshita's face turned pale. Why had he stopped him from declining earlier? T/N calm down mate. Chapter 8. Back then, Kinoshita-sensei thought I was completely out of strength. He was thrilled, gathered all his energy, and was just about to take me down. But what he never expected was that I'd unleash a secret family technique, gathering all the spiritual pressure I'd been saving up and releasing it in one powerful burst, achieving unimaginable strength. With that unstoppable move, I struck down Kinoshita in one blow, winning the match. From this story, did any of you gain some insight? T/N, okay, I am starting to love this guy XD. Looking at Kaelith, who was sitting at the podium and talking eloquently, a student who was listening attentively raised his hand. When faced with difficulties, don't give up easily. Another student shook his head. No, it's about always preparing yourself as much as possible so you can turn things around at a crucial moment. A third student slightly lifted their head. You're both wrong. What Kaelith is really trying to say is that family resources are essential for a Shinigami. As his classmates discussed, Kaelith Yurei slapped his thigh with enthusiasm. Wrong, all of you. The story actually tells us that Kinoshita's reign is coming to an end. If we unite, we can overthrow his tyranny and bring a brighter future for Class 7. The students looked at Kaelith, stunned. Could that really be the takeaway? In the third row of the classroom, Kokaki-shun nodded thoughtfully. Kaelith's plan is pretty clever, using humor to mask his actual strength. Saving up his spiritual pressure and releasing it all at once. To most people, that sounds believable enough. This way, the rumors about him will probably spread a bit slower. Hearing this, Synopsis Yamada chuckled. You're overthinking it, Kokaki. From my perspective, Kaelith is just boasting for fun. Shun instinctively wanted to argue but couldn't quite find the words. Indeed, considering Kaelith Yurei's personality, it really might just be casual nonsense. He turned to Aizen. Suk, what do you think? I'd rather not think about it. Aizen held his head on his forehead. The thought of that guy up on the podium having the same level of potential as himself felt absurdly surreal. It was almost unbearable. Fortunately, Kaelith's antics didn't last long. Before too much time passed, Kinoshita entered the classroom with the materials, and with a shout, Kaelith's little group quickly dispersed. Standing at the podium, Kinoshita gave Kaelith a complicated look. Who would have thought that this troublemaker, this mischief maker, who'd caused so much chaos, would have such a hidden depth? And even more unbelievable was how this guy, through some inexplicable luck, had caught the eye of the Captain Commander, becoming his student. Every time Kinoshita thought about it, he couldn't help but marvel at how strange fate was. As the morning classes concluded, Kaelith and his friends headed to the cafeteria. Thanks to Shun Kokaki's generous sponsorship, the four of them enjoyed a hearty lunch. During the meal, Synopsis, using his quick reflexes, managed to snag an extra piece of tempura shrimp, leaving Kaelith in regret. After the meal, Shun put down his chopsticks and looked at Kaelith. Kaelith, did you get summoned by the Captain Commander yesterday? Hearing this, Synopsis Yamada, who was sitting nearby, was taken by surprise and turned to look at Kaelith. Aizen also looked over at him. Kaelith paused for a moment, then, remembering Shun's identity, showed a look of understanding. Under the gaze of the three, he nodded. Yes, the Captain Commander asked me to come to his place once a week to learn. As soon as these words were out, not only Kokaki and Synopsis, but even Aizen couldn't help but show a surprised expression. Synopsis was a bit excited. You're telling me the captain commander of the Gotei 13, Yamamoto Genrisai Shigakuni, has taken you as his disciple. Kaelith shook his head. It's not exactly as a disciple, just that I'll be going once a week to learn. If I had to compare it, it's more like an extra tutoring class. Tutoring class. Hearing this strange term, Sōsuke gave him a confused look. But he quickly dismissed the question and continued. You fool, that's practically the same thing as being a disciple. Even though you're strong, compared to that man, you're still far from his level. Having him teach you once a week is already more than enough for you to process. Damn, you're so lucky to be favored by the captain commander himself. At this point, Sōsuke showed a slightly conflicted expression. Well, it's not just luck. If you look throughout Soul Society's history, how many people have gained such strength at your speed? Maybe, you're the only one. Upon hearing this, Kaelith shook his head. No, my strength is the same as Sōsuke's. What? Sōsuke turned to Aizen, stunned. Aizen paused for a moment, then helplessly said, Don't listen to Kaelith, if I had that kind of power, don't you think I'd be using it? Sōsuke seemed a little suspicious. Usually, I'd agree with you, but considering Kaelith has hidden his strength before, and you two are often together, there's a chance you're hiding something too. Aizen. T/N Aizen right now, degree. As someone who prided himself on personal development, good character, and lofty ideals, comparing himself to Kaelith Yurei always felt somewhat insulting. Shun thought for a moment and then nodded slightly. I see now. The captain commander is probably using this method to protect you. With him behind you, even if the nobles want to recruit you, they can only approach you in a friendly way, they can't force you. After all, it seems the captain commander doesn't plan to directly participate in this conflict. But if anything happens to his newly accepted student, it could complicate things. He looked at Kaelith, offering a sincere smile. That's great, Kaelith. With this, you don't have to worry about outside interference. You can focus on your studies and training without distraction. Looking at Shun, who seemed to radiate a holy light, Kaelith felt a rare sense of self-doubt. Was he really worthy to be friends with someone as pure and noble as Shun? But then he glanced at the other two sitting nearby. But then, he glanced over at the two sitting beside him, one a grumpy old man in disguise, the other a sharp-tongued troublemaker. In comparison, maybe he wasn't so bad after all. After returning to the classroom, Kaelith followed his usual routine, preparing the materials he would need for the afternoon class and placing them on his desk. This afternoon's class was on Kaid, specifically the healing Kendo. Most of the students in the class didn't have much interest in Kaid, and only those aiming to join the 4th division were serious about learning it. Of course, as a self-disciplined and proactive student, even though Kaelith wasn't particularly interested in Kaid, he still planned to pay attention. However, after waiting for a long time, Kinoshita still hadn't arrived for the lesson. Just as Kaelith began to wonder if Kinoshita had eaten something bad for lunch and was now struggling in the restroom, a figure slowly entered the classroom. Seeing this person, Kaelith froze for a moment. Then, his eyes widened in shock. Chapter 9. Seeing the figure walking into the classroom, all the students were stunned. A gentle smile, a delicate face, 2 braids coiled together and hanging down from her chest, and a white haori. F4th Division Captain, Anohana Retsu. One student couldn't help but exclaim. Kaelith leaned back slightly and whispered to Aizen Sōsuke, sitting behind him, Sōsuke, do you think Captain Anohana discovered you have rebellious thoughts behind your back, and she's here to capture you, who will be the future great threat to Soul Society? Aizen. He replied irritably, if anyone in our group is going to be a future threat to Soul Society, it would definitely be you. Upon hearing this, Kaelith was about to laugh, but then he remembered Aizen Sōsuke's sharp senses and his exceptional ability to read people. His heart sank. Sōsuke, are you joking? Who knows? Aizen gave him a strange, almost imperceptible smile. As the students whispered among themselves, Anohana Retsu calmly walked to the podium and offered a gentle smile to the crowd. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Captain Anohana Retsu of the 4th Division. I am here today because Kinoshita-sensei is ill and unable to teach, so I've come to assist by giving a class on healing Kendo. Please rest assured, I have a bit of experience in this area, and I won't delay your studies. Upon hearing Anohana's words, the students exchanged looks, unsure of how to react. So modest, a bit of experience, one of them muttered internally. If the 4th Division captain only has a bit of experience, does that mean all of us should go back to the drawing board and start over? After her introduction, Anohana continued, today's lesson involves a lot of practical work, so I'll need a volunteer to assist me. Hearing this, some of the bolder students couldn't hide their excitement. Just the thought of being close to Captain Anohana, helping her out, was enough to thrill anyone. As the students looked on, some hopeful, some nervous, Anohana's gaze swept over the class. Then, her eyes stopped at Kaelith Yurei. Excuse me, could I ask you to assist me? Kaelith was momentarily stunned. After confirming that Anohana was speaking to him, he seemed to realize something. Sōsuke, after class today, you must teach me how to perfectly hide my spiritual pressure level. Aizen shook his head gently. I can't help you. That's nonsense. If you can't help, why did Captain Anohana notice a problem with me immediately? We have the same spiritual pressure level. Aizen sighed, as I said, I don't have the strength you think I do. I'm just an ordinary student. Kaelith chuckled and was about to say something when Anohana, still smiling, spoke again from the podium. Could I ask you again, would you be willing to assist me? Although her expression was kind, the moment she said these words, Kaelith Yurei felt as if he had been thrown into an ancient ice cavern. The instant chill that pierced his soul wasn't from spiritual energy related to ice, it was pure murderous intent. He jumped up immediately, it would be my greatest honor. Looking at Yurei's bleak gaze, Anohana nodded with a smile, as though the terrifying pressure she had just exuded had never existed. Fortunately, the so-called assistant duties weren't very complicated. It was just helping Anohana Retsu move the prepared animals. Under Retsu's guidance, the students created various wounds on the animals and then used Kendo, healing Kendo, to treat them. Kaelith wasn't particularly skilled at Kendo, not because he didn't want to learn it. In fact, he really wanted to learn it well. After all, the 4th Division had a lot of beautiful women, and if he could become a seated officer there, his life would definitely be colorful. Unfortunately, his talent in this area was average, and he could barely pass the class. Aizen Sōsuke's Kendo skills were only slightly better than his. This was probably the only ability that didn't improve after their powers had synchronized. Anohana glanced at Yurei's healing and then shifted her gaze. After surveying the students, she suddenly let out a soft hum. Following her gaze, Kaelith Yurei looked over. He saw Synopsis Yamamoto lazily treating a rabbit. In the green glow emanating from him, the wound on the rabbit, caused by a blade, was visibly healing at an accelerated pace. A few seconds later, the wound, which had originally been 2 centimeters long, had completely closed, even forming a scab. Anohana Retsu looked intrigued. Kaelith-kun, what's the name of that child? Synopsis, Yamamoto Synopsis, Kaelith replied. Kinoshita-sensei mentioned that his Kaido talent is exceptional. If he were willing to join the 4th Division, he could skip the exam and directly graduate to our division. Upon hearing this, Anohana's expression showed interest. She stood up and walked in the direction of Yamamoto Synopsis. Watching Anohana walk away, Kaelith smiled warmly. He was truly a good person, always seizing every opportunity to look out for his friend's future. It had nothing to do with the fact that Yamamoto Synopsis had stolen his fried shrimp at lunch and he was secretly seeking revenge. It was rare to find someone as kind-hearted as himself these days. Sure enough, as soon as Yamamoto Synopsis saw Anohana approaching, he showed an expression of dread. As Kaelith had said, his Kaido talent was extremely abnormal, and all the teachers at the Seirai acknowledged that his Kaido technique surpassed that of Kaelith. Several teachers had specifically approached him, hoping he would join the 4th Division, but Yamamoto Synopsis had rejected all of them. To him, spending every day in a hospital treating people was a boring life. Compared to joining the 4th Division, it seemed more fun to follow Kaelith. It would be best if the two of them joined the 11th Division together. That idea was very exciting to him. Thus, when facing Anohana, he made a strong show of being uncooperative. Whenever Anohana asked him to heal, he deliberately made mistakes, and when she asked him about human organ structures, he would simply reply that he didn't know. Seeing Yamamoto Synopsis' attitude, Anohana Retsu's expression became thoughtful. After a moment, she smiled. Yamamoto, is it that you don't like Kaido? Yes, Yamamoto Synopsis answered indifferently. If it weren't for the fact that Anohana Retsu was one of the captains of the 13 court guard squads, he wouldn't have even bothered responding. Anohana smiled again and said, so, what is your goal? Yamamoto Synopsis gave a mocking grin. Of course, it's to get stronger, especially in swordsmanship. Using Kido or Kaido is too soft, and not interesting. My goal is to become a master of swordsmanship. So sorry, Captain Anohana, but the 4th Division can't satisfy my ambitions. For some reason, at the moment he spoke those words, Yamada Sōsuke suddenly felt a slight but unmistakable sense of danger in Anohana's smile. As he watched in confusion, Anohana nodded. I see now. I understand. T/N well P is screwed. Chapter 10. Shin'ō Academy, Swordsmanship Dojo. Kaelith Yurei knelt on the floor in a less than perfect posture, with the bamboo practice sword placed in front of him. For a moment, it felt like he was back in class yesterday afternoon. He found himself lost in thought. How did he end up here again when he was just in Kido class? Half an hour ago, he'd been in the classroom, gathering the rabbits used for healing practice, when Anohana suddenly spoke up. Students, I just confirmed that the next Hakuda, T/N, hand-to-hand combat, class teacher is also out sick, so I'll be covering one more period. However, I'm not very skilled in Hakuda, so we'll be switching it to swordsmanship instead. Please take a 10-minute break and then meet in the Kendo dojo. Kaelith couldn't help but feel puzzled at her announcement. He'd been standing right next to Anohana the entire time. How could he have missed the news that the next instructor had fallen ill? If his old PE teacher from before he came to Soul Society had seen this scene, they'd definitely feel a sense of familiarity. So, after a brief break, Class 7 students arrived at the Kendo dojo. Under the eager gazes of the students, Anohana slowly stepped to the front of the dojo. Holding a bamboo sword, her demeanor seemed to shift slightly. In the Kido classroom earlier, she had been gentle and serene. Now, there was a faint sharpness in her presence. All right, everyone, the Zanjutsu, T/N swordsmanship, class is now starting. As I'm not entirely sure of your current skill levels, today's class will be a bit unusual. From now on, each of you will take turns sparring with me. I'll evaluate your level and help identify areas for improvement this way. Let's start with this student here. Before the students could react, Anohana was already smiling, her gaze landing on a student in a blue and white uniform. The student froze for a moment, then quickly stood up and walked over, holding his bamboo sword. Watching this unfold, Sōsuke Yamada couldn't help but feel curious. What's going on here? Isn't the 4th Division supposed to prioritize healing abilities as a measure of skill? While I don't doubt Captain Anohana's expertise in Kido, swordsmanship, I hope she doesn't mislead them with unorthodox techniques. If her instruction isn't up to standard, it might leave students with bad habits. Hearing this, Kokaki Shun smirked slightly. On that point, Sōsuke, you don't need to worry. Captain Anohana holds the title of a 10th Dan in swordsmanship, certified by the Siraidii. See notes. Sōsuke stiffened. What? Bang! At the same moment he spoke, Anohana effortlessly parried a few strikes from the student and then, with a slight movement, knocked his bamboo sword aside. She lowered her bamboo sword, her voice calm and gentle. You're focusing too much on your upper body and neglecting your footwork. Moving forward, work on harmonizing your footwork with your swordsmanship until it becomes second nature. Upon hearing Anohana's advice, the student appeared enlightened and quickly nodded, bowing deeply to express his gratitude. Next, the second student stepped forward. After just a few moves, Anohana subdued her opponent effortlessly. Your sword stance is not very stable. During regular training, you don't seem fully focused when practicing with your blade, and your form falters. This might seem like a minor issue now, but as your skills improve, a shaky foundation will lead to more severe problems. Keep this in mind. The second student's eyes widened in surprise. In truth, he often slacked off during his training swings, and even Kinoshita hadn't noticed it. He hadn't expected Captain Anohana to pinpoint his flaw so quickly with only a few exchanges. He hurriedly bowed. Thank you very much for your guidance. I'll remember it. As the third, fourth, and more students stepped up, each one was quickly defeated while receiving precise, targeted feedback. Gradually, Sōsuke Yamada's eyes began to show interest. Aizen stepped forward with his bamboo sword and exchanged 4 or 5 moves with Anohana before he was defeated. Looking at the young man in front of her, his expression calm and unbothered by his loss, Anohana gave an approving nod. Your basics are solid, and you respond well under pressure. Keep practicing diligently, just as you are. I look forward to seeing your future progress. Aizen gave a slight bow. Thank you for your guidance. The students around them looked surprised by Anohana's praise for Aizen. Since the class had started, this was the first time Captain Anohana had offered such a comprehensive compliment to a student. Aizen-suke, the quiet guy who kept a low profile, the one mostly known as a member of Kaelith's crew who knew he had some real skill? T/Nha don't let him hear what you call their gang. As Aizen walked back, Kaelith raised an eyebrow. So you decided to show a bit of your strength, hey? Aizen knelt beside him, sighing slightly. It wasn't a bit of strength, I used my full effort. Kaelith grinned. You say it seriously, so I'll take it seriously. Hearing this, Aizen turned to him with curiosity. Kaelith, why are you so convinced that I'm hiding my true strength? Kaelith raised his head confidently. Suke, I know you better than you think. No one understands Aizen-suke better than I do. Aizen couldn't help but feel puzzled, seeing Kaelith's confident expression. He could tell that this guy genuinely believed he knew him well. So where did this confidence come from? Could it be, as Kaelith claimed, that he really saw through him and knew everything about him? Impossible. While Aizen pondered this, at the front of the dojo, Kokaki-shun and Anohana Retsu had entered an intense duel. Unlike the other students who had faced Anohana before, Kokaki-shun displayed the bearing of a true heir to one of the four great noble clans, meeting Anohana's level of skill head-on. With both hands gripping the bamboo sword, he moved like a finely tuned machine, blocking each of Anohana's strikes at lightning speed, all while seizing any opening to counterattack. Anohana's goal was to assess the students' abilities, not to overpower them, so she limited her strength to a certain level. Facing Shun's perfect blend of offense and defense, she was pleasantly reminded of the thrill of a real duel. After a few more exchanges, she seized an opening and delivered a swift diagonal slash that sent Shun's bamboo sword flying. Looking at the refined young man before her, she nodded. Jinrei has truly raised an outstanding successor. Hearing this, Kokaki-shun paused in surprise. Then, he bowed deeply. Note, 10th Dan isn't an actual term in Bleach from what I remember. It's something new to this novel. I couldn't change it to the first Kenpake since that information was a secret. Chapter 11. Kaelith Yurei held his bamboo sword and slowly walked back, kneeling beside Shun Kokaki. Shun sighed, saying, Captain Anohana is truly an extraordinary individual. Is it because she praised you? Kaelith asked. How could that be? Shun responded, half laughing and half exasperated. Meanwhile, Sōsuke Yamada, who had been restless, couldn't sit still any longer. The moment Shun sat down, Sōsuke sprang to his feet, striding toward Anohana Retsu as if preparing for a fight. Stopping in front of the serene and smiling Anohana, Sōsuke fixed her with a sharp gaze, slightly bowing his head. Sōsuke Yamada, Captain Anohana, please grant me your guidance. Anohana nodded lightly. Come, show me the strength of one who aspires to master swordsmanship. Hearing this, Sōsuke took a deep breath, gripping his bamboo sword with both hands. He sprang into action like a wild beast unleashed, spinning fiercely as he swung the bamboo blade toward Anohana Retsu. The students in the front row, witnessing this ferocity, gasped in surprise. While they knew Sōsuke had a reputation for being ruthless, none had imagined he'd dare use such an audacious approach against a captain. As the bamboo sword descended, Anohana, who had been smiling gently, slowly opened her eyes. Shun stiffened as though struck by an icy breeze on a hot summer's day. Even Kaelith found himself tensing involuntarily. The warmth radiating from Anohana moments earlier abruptly transformed into a chilling, bone-piercing aura that almost compelled Kaelith to draw his blade instinctively. The students, unaware of the nuances, only felt that Anohana's presence had changed. But for Sōsuke, who faced her directly, the sensation was overwhelming. In his eyes, a dark, eerie energy seemed to envelop Anohana, seeping into his body through every pore and chilling him to the core. It was as if the figure before him wasn't a captain of the Gotei 13, but a terrifying demon risen from the deepest pits of hell. That demon smiled, raising a rusted blade stained with dried blood. Then, it swung down. Under the stunned gazes of the students, Sōsuke, who had launched himself like a beast, froze mid-air. With a swift movement, Anohana's bamboo sword struck him, sending him flying sideways to crash heavily onto the ground. He didn't move. Sōsuke! Shun exclaimed in alarm, quickly getting up and running over. Kneeling beside Sōsuke, Shun checked on him, only to find that Sōsuke was completely unharmed. Instead, the man lay there with a look of wild fervor on his face. Sōsuke. Shun frowned slightly. Lord Kokaki. I've found the division I want to join, Sōsuke murmured dreamily, as if talking in his sleep. Shun was baffled. Before he could say anything further, Sōsuke suddenly sat up. Did you see it? That demon-like figure, that's what true strength looks like. Just being caught in her gaze felt like being torn apart by countless blades, dying over and over again. This is the life I want to pursue. Shun. He wasn't sure what kind of life Sōsuke was after, but it was clear the man needed his head checked. Sōsuke quickly got to his feet, running over to Anohana and bowing deeply. Captain Anohana. I, Sōsuke Yamada, will take the graduation exam at the end of this semester. Please, grant me the honor of serving in Squad 4 under your command. Anohana covered her mouth, laughing softly. Very well. Having pledged his loyalty, Sōsuke returned, looking as light as a feather. His bizarrely contented expression made Kaelith feel as though ants were crawling all over him. Great. The kid's lost it. T/N, but who could ever resist her? Looking at Anohana standing not far away with her bamboo sword, Kaelith suddenly felt a little nervous. Could she have some strange ability to brainwash people through combat? Shaking off the thought, Kaelith stood up and walked toward the center of the dojo. He had already decided when the fight began, he'd deflect a few strikes and then throw the match to avoid drawing attention. Kaelith Yurei, at your service. I'm looking forward to your performance, Kaelith, Anohana said with a smile, her eyes curving into crescents. This boy, who had even caught the attention of the captain commander, intrigued her. Initially, Anohana had accepted the invitation to lecture at the Shin'ō Academy to provide a basic class for first-year students. However, upon hearing that the captain commander had summoned Kaelith, she had adjusted her plans, specifically coming to teach class 7 of the first year. Unexpectedly, aside from Kaelith, she had stumbled upon another promising individual. Satisfied with gaining Sōsuke as a potential recruit, her opinion of Kaelith had also improved. Originally, she only intended to test Kaelith's abilities out of curiosity. But now, she felt it would be disrespectful to hold back. As a swordswoman, the highest respect she could show was to use as much of her strength as possible, leaving both parties with an unforgettable experience. Having made up her mind, Anohana stepped forward, suddenly launching an attack toward Kaelith. Kaelith, who was prepared to block a few blows and gracefully lose, was stunned as Anohana charged like an ancient beast. What the? Faced with the terror of life and death, all his previous plans flew out the window. His body moved instinctively, swinging the bamboo sword. Asterisk clack. 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 Clack, asterisk. The relentless clash of bamboo swords echoed like a torrential downpour, shocking the ears of every student present. The students gaped at the scene, their expressions as if they had seen a ghost. When Shun had sparred with Anohana earlier, her speed and strength had already been unfathomable, with most students unable to follow her movements. Now, the exchange between Kaelith and Anohana had created a chaotic web of intersecting bamboo strikes, forming an abstract picture. It was impossible to discern when the swords collided or parted. Their movements were beyond comprehension. Sōsuke's jaw dropped. Kaelith. His swordsmanship is this good on top of his spirit pressure. Shun was utterly stunned. Kaelith's display completely overwhelmed him. As a noble heir, he had undergone elite training within the Kokaki family, even receiving personal instruction from Jinrei Kokaki, one of the strongest Shinigami in the Soul Society. Yet compared to Kaelith, all his efforts and resources felt like a joke. Aizen, observing from the sidelines, let a spark of interest flash in his eyes. Fascinating. Not only in spirit pressure, but even in swordsmanship, Kaelith was on par with him. Just how many secrets was this boy hiding? Aizen's curiosity was thoroughly piqued. Chapter 12. A surprising hint of sympathy emerged in Aizen's mind as he observed Kaelith Yurei. Since their first meeting, Kaelith had never once displayed his true strength. It wasn't hard to guess that Kaelith, like Aizen himself, preferred to keep his full abilities hidden. The key difference, however, was that Aizen was cautious and lucky enough to avoid situations where he was forced to reveal his power. Kaelith wasn't so fortunate. First, he got severely punished by Kinojita for skipping class. If he hadn't shown his real strength, he might have ended up in Squad 4's infirmary for days. Then, he ran into Anohana Retsu, the unreasonably battle-obsessed maniac. At that thought, Aizen shook his head, a faint smile curling his lips. Well, perhaps it's for the best. Someone as impulsive as Kaelith could use a humbling experience or two. Given how miserable his situation was now, Aizen decided he would find an opportunity to teach Kaelith some techniques for concealing spirit pressure. At the dojo, Kaelith Yurei fought with all his might, every nerve in his body on edge. Initially, he had gone all out because he was intimidated by Anohana's overwhelming opening attack, instinctively reacting in defense. But as the fight went on, he began to notice something unusual. It seemed as though Anohana was intentionally using their battle to adjust minor issues in his swordsmanship while also helping him become more familiar with his techniques. The abilities he had synchronized from Aizen weren't fully effective yet, lacking the necessary practice and polish. That was why he had spent so much effort in his dormitory digesting the footwork knowledge Aizen had shared with him. By his calculations, it would have taken him at least a month or two of solo practice to fully master the sword techniques he gained from Aizen. But now, under Anohana's flawless guidance, his swordsmanship was improving at a staggering pace. In just over a minute, Kaelith felt as though he was on the verge of fully absorbing the sword techniques he had synchronized from Aizen. Realizing this, his gaze toward Anohana grew fiery with excitement. If he could spar with Anohana every time he synchronized new abilities from Aizen to refine and assimilate them, wouldn't he be unstoppable? Noticing Kaelith's eager expression, Anohana's lips curved into a smile. Oh? Excellent. This child wasn't frightened by her attacks. Instead, he looked exhilarated by the battle. What a promising seedling. She couldn't wait to see how he'd grow in the future. Perhaps, someday, he might even make her feel excited again. As her emotions soared, Anohana's attacks became even fiercer. Half a minute later, Kaelith finally faltered. His bamboo sword slipped slightly off angle, and with a loud snap, it was cleaved in two by Anohana's strike, its splintered fibers scattering. Whoosh! After slicing through Kaelith's bamboo sword, Anohana's blade continued forward, stopping just before it could slice his neck. A brief silence hung in the dojo before Anohana slowly lowered her bamboo sword. With a slightly regretful expression, she remarked, "We couldn't finish to the very end, hey." But almost immediately, her familiar smile returned. "Well then, let's leave the rest for next time. I'm looking forward to that day, Kaelith-kun." Kaelith's lips twitched slightly, but he said nothing. He took back his earlier thoughts. Anohana was far too dangerous. While she could be an excellent teacher when calm, her murderous aura when fully engaged was enough to terrify anyone. Just moments ago, he had a strong premonition that he might genuinely die at her hands. It was a feeling he never wanted to experience again. Only now did the students finally realize they could breathe, and the dojo filled with the sound of gasping breaths. As the students watched Anohana, a mix of tension, amazement, and excitement on their faces, she clasped her hands gently in front of her and bowed slightly. "Everyone, today's special lesson ends here. It was a pleasure spending these 2 class periods with you all. I hope we'll have another opportunity like this. Oh, and if any of you are interested in joining Squad 4 in the future, feel free to visit the Career Counseling Office to pick up our recruitment brochure. I personally wrote the introduction about Squad 4. With that, this graceful, and kind-hearted, captain left the dojo, heading toward the gates of Shin'ō Academy. As they watched her departing figure, the students couldn't help but start murmuring amongst themselves. Carrying his broken bamboo sword, Kaelith slowly walked over to Kukaki-shun, who wore a serious expression. "Kaelith, let's spar after school," Shun said. "If you don't want to be seen, we can go to a nearby farm owned by the Kukaki family. I'll clear everyone out, so it'll just be us." Kaelith nodded. Sure. Though he hated trouble, helping a friend was different. Besides, sparring with Shun would help him improve his swordsmanship as well, a win-win. Over the next few days, Yamada Sōsuke seemed like a completely different person. He dug out his neglected healing Kendo textbooks from the dorm and began reviewing them meticulously, starting from the basics. For most people, this would have been a waste of time, but Sōsuke, a once-in-a-millennium genius in the healing arts, managed to master everything in the textbooks within just a few days and began tackling advanced problems on his own. Kaelith was glad they weren't competing in the same field. Otherwise, he might have cried from envy. During their free time, the group of 4 often visited the Kukaki family farm to spar with each other. Aizen, initially uninterested in group practice, preferred solitary training. But Kaelith's relentless pestering eventually wore him down. One shameless threat sealed the deal: "If you don't come, I'll tell everyone at school you're hiding your true strength and that I can actually beat you. Faced with Kaelith's absurd strategy of dragging himself down just to drag Aizen with him, Aizen finally caved. And so, 4 days passed in the blink of an eye. That evening, after dinner, Kaelith was strolling in the courtyard when a voice suddenly rang in his ears. Kaelith Yurei, report to the 1st Division barracks for class tomorrow. Kaelith jumped in shock before realizing what was happening. It was a message sent by Yamamoto through Kendo. Most likely, it was Tenran Kra, a one-way communication Kendo. Kaelith stopped walking and raised an eyebrow. Humph. You think I'll just go because you told me to? What about my dignity? If there's any reason you can't make it, feel free to inform this old man, the voice continued. Kaelith froze. Damn it, it was two-way communication. Chapter 13. Ah! Inside the 1st Division dojo, Kaelith Yurei let out a rather undignified scream as he collapsed onto the ground, eyes squeezed shut and mouth agape. Yamamoto gently lowered his bamboo sword, his expression one of mild exasperation. He hadn't even used much force with that strike. Was this really necessary? After pondering for a few moments, Yamamoto nodded slightly and said, I've got a good grasp of your situation now. Even though I had set high expectations for you, your abilities have still exceeded my predictions. If you can continue down the right path, without distractions clouding your way, your potential will be limitless. Kaelith slowly picked himself up. Wait a minute, head captain, I've just been beaten half to death, and instead of checking on my injuries, you go straight to lecturing me. A vein popped on Yamamoto's forehead. Injuries? You call that an injury? The Seirai does not produce such fragile Shinigami. Kaelith sighed deeply. Being a Shinigami was tough, completely lacking the perks of a career in singing, dancing, or rapping. After some thought, Yamamoto spoke up again. Kaelith Yurei, have you achieved Shikai yet? Kaelith shook his head. No. Despite synchronizing with Aizen's powers, he hadn't gained Kaika Suijutsu. In fact, he hadn't even unlocked Shikai as a general ability. Kaelith figured this was due to the unique nature of Zanpakuto. The power of a Zanpakuto reflects the attributes of one's soul. Only through communication with one's soul could one infuse energy into an Asachi and achieve release. No matter how much spirit pressure he synchronized from Aizen, it wouldn't change the nature of his soul. To unlock his Zanpakuto, he'd have to rely on himself. Hearing Kaelith's reply, Yamamoto frowned slightly. It was unusual for someone with vice-captain level strength to not have unlocked Shikai. This typically indicated a lack of understanding of one's soul, or insufficient conviction, a sign of an immature spirit. The clearer Kaelith's potential became, the more Yamamoto worried he might stray from the right path. After some thought, Yamamoto instructed, if that's the case, your primary goal from now on should be unlocking your Zanpakuto. Starting today, I'll teach you a new meditation technique. You'll meditate for at least 2 hours a day to expedite communication with your Zanpakuto. With that, Yamamoto sat cross-legged on the floor and began teaching Kaelith the meditation method he'd developed. The principles of the technique were simple: achieve a state of ultimate calm, regulate spirit pressure, and stimulate the body and mind to maintain a heightened state of relaxation, enabling prolonged communication with the Zanpakuto. After a few attempts, Kaelith managed to enter the meditative state. However, despite meditating for quite some time, all he experienced was aimlessly drifting through darkness. He didn't hear a single whisper from his Zanpakuto, let alone achieve release. Yamamoto didn't say much about this, merely advising him to keep practicing. If you can't achieve Shikai in the short term, then learn a technique that can temporarily substitute for it. Both Shinigami and Hollows often possess unique abilities. Engaging in direct combat with an unfamiliar opponent can be highly dangerous. Under Kaelith's watchful gaze, Yamamoto raised his bamboo sword. With a sharp downward swing, a silver crescent-shaped energy wave shot forward, striking a reinforced target stone and leaving a deep gash. Kaelith blinked in surprise. Get Shuga Tensh. What? Yamamoto frowned. Ah, nothing, Kaelith said quickly. I just remembered a story I heard in Rukanga as a kid. There was a move similar to what you just did. Yamamoto nodded. He'd heard of newly arrived souls from the world of the living retaining fragments of their memories, so he wasn't concerned about Kaelith's remark. He slowly spoke, this move is called Kanatsu. The principle is similar to Had, in that it converts spiritual pressure into a special attribute. For example, the Had number 4, Byakurai, White Lightning, converts spiritual pressure into lightning. The head number 30, Skatsui, blue fire, crash down, converts spiritual pressure into fire. The principle of sword pressure is to use the Zanpakutetsu enhancement to transform one's spiritual pressure into the attribute of cutting. Now, I will go over the details of this technique, and you must remember them clearly. While under Kaelith's gaze, Yamamoto explained the technique of sword pressure at a steady pace. After finishing his explanation, he asked, "Did you remember everything?" Kaelith pondered for a few seconds before answering, "I've already forgotten half of it." Yamamoto. He was puzzled. "What part did you forget?" Kaelith thought for a moment. "Now, I've forgotten most of it." Yamamoto. Before Yamamoto could say anything else, Kaelith clapped his hands. "Now, I've completely forgotten." With that, he slightly tilted his head, revealing the smile of a master who was at peace with his solitude. Having said such high-level profound words, Yamamoto would surely be deeply moved, thinking he had discovered a martial arts genius. Perhaps, in his excitement, Yamamoto would even bring out some secret techniques, who knows. Kaelith looked expectantly, but Yamamoto took a deep breath. Then, he roared, "Get your ass out right now! You must master it within this week. If you can't, I'll show you the consequences of mocking your elders." Without waiting for Kaelith to say anything further, Yamamoto immediately sent him flying out of the dojo. Watching the dojo door slam shut with a bang, Kaelith couldn't help but feel some emotion. Yamamoto truly had no understanding of what it meant to have style. No wonder he fell during the 1000-year blood war. In the realm of hot-blooded manga, style is power. Once you lose that style, you naturally become background filler. Captain Yamamoto still needs a lot of training. As Kaelith prepared to head back, his expression suddenly shifted. Judging by the time, Shin'ō Academy's dining hall must have already stopped serving dinner. If he returned now, he'd probably have to go hungry all night. Fortunately, a solution quickly came to mind. As the leader of the Gotei 13, the 1st Division's dining hall surely still had food available. With his current skill set, sneaking in to grab some food would be a piece of cake. The abilities he'd gained from Aizen hadn't yet seen much practical use. Tonight, they'd finally have their moment to shine. If these abilities had feelings, they'd probably be moved to tears by finally being put to good use, wouldn't they? A smirk spread across Kaelith's face as he dashed off. It didn't take long for him to find the 1st Division's dining hall. Hugging the wall outside, he cautiously scanned the area for any enemies before creeping toward an open window. Suddenly, a voice sounded beside him. "What are you doing?" "Whoa!" Kaelith exclaimed, spinning around in shock. Standing next to him was a young, dark-skinned girl in a cloak, smiling mischievously at him. T/N oh no, the two menaces have finally met. Chapter 14. Kaelith Yurei jumped in surprise at the sudden appearance of a figure. Thanks to a certain someone, his spirit pressure detection skills had significantly improved. He could sense approaching Shinigami, even members of the 2nd Division Stealth Force, long before they got too close. Yet, now, someone had managed to get this close without him noticing. After staring at the person for a few seconds, he frowned. Shin'ō Academy. Though her hair was short and her clothing different, the girl's overall presence was strikingly similar to the Shin'ō Academy he'd seen in the anime. The girl raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Oh? You know me?" "I do. Lord Kukaki mentioned you to me." "Lord Kukaki? Kukaki-shun? Ah, that good-natured guy." When Kukaki-shun was mentioned, Yurei-shine grinned slightly. When she refocused, she realized Kaelith had already moved to a nearby window, carefully peering inside. She quickly followed him. "You're wearing a Shin uniform and sneaking around the 1st Division's barracks. You're Kaelith Yurei, right? That genius student?" Yurei circled around him, her curious gaze unwavering. Kaelith nodded, then shook his head. "I'm Kaelith Yurei, but I'm not a genius student. The real genius is Aizen-suke, my classmate." Yurei tilted her head, pondering for a moment before shaking it. "Never heard of him." "There's a lot you haven't heard of." After surveying his target, Kaelith chuckled and climbed through the window. Seeing this, Yurei followed suit. As her eyes scanned the kitchen filled with ingredients, she asked, "What are you doing here?" "Looking for food, obviously. Or do you think I'm here to cook?" Kaelith shot her a pitying glance. For someone who looked so sharp, she sure asked silly questions. Was this supposed to be endearing? Yurei. Earlier, she had spotted someone sneaking toward the First Division's kitchen. Her first thought was that the person might be trying to poison the food. She'd been ready to act immediately, but upon noticing the Shin uniform, she paused. A Shin student in the First Division's barracks. Those two clues together made the intruder's identity clear. Kaelith Yurei. A commoner from Rokanga who, in less than 6 months of training, had reached the strength of a vice-captain and earned the personal tutelage of Yamamoto himself. Such a prodigy wouldn't be sent on a low-level task like poisoning food, even if he were a spy for the rebel nobles. So, instead of striking, she revealed herself to observe. And it turned out, he was just looking for food? Were Shin students not getting enough to eat these days? Noticing her confusion, Kaelith swallowed a mouthful of meat. Shin Yurei, you've never attended Shin Academy, have you? Yurei blinked, then nodded. The Shin family children are educated within the family, trained in stealth and combat skills. Our curriculum is different from Shin's, so we don't attend the academy. Exactly. Kaelith took a sip of soup, his expression satisfied. The Gotei 13 often had missions at night, so the kitchen always kept soup warm. After swallowing another mouthful, he continued, at Shin, meals are served at fixed times. If you miss the mealtime, you go hungry. I may skip classes or training drills, but I never miss a meal. Today, I missed dinner only because the head captain was messing with me. So, eating his food is perfectly fair. Watching Kaelith spout nonsense with such a straight face, Yurei couldn't help but smile. This guy was surprisingly interesting. As she observed him, Kaelith seemed to remember something. Want some? He tore a drumstick off a roasted chicken and offered it to Yurei. Surprised at first, Yurei broke into a grin and accepted it, taking a bite. After swallowing, she laughed. You're not bad, you know. Even though this chicken isn't yours, sharing the best part with someone you just met shows you're a decent person. Kaelith shook his head. Sharing my food isn't about being nice, it's for 2 reasons. First, you're cute. Sharing with you doesn't feel like a loss. Second, by eating my chicken, you're now an accomplice. If you report me to the head captain later, you'll also get scolded. That way, I avoid potential trouble. Yurei. The first part made her smile, the second almost made her choke. While it was logical, saying it so bluntly was downright infuriating. She was about to retort when Kaelith suddenly frowned. Trouble. Someone's coming. As his words fell, Yurei also sensed an approaching spirit pressure. Surprised, she glanced at him. As the heir to the Shin family, she had been trained in stealth detection from a young age. Among her peers, no one surpassed her in sensing spirit pressure. Yet Kaelith had detected the presence faster than she had. This guy was full of surprises. From a distance, voices could be heard. Vice Captain Sōsuke. Has anyone suspicious approached? Report, Vice Captain. All is clear. Despite the reply, Sōsuke didn't seem reassured. Moments later, the door to the kitchen creaked open, and Sōsuke entered. Kaelith's face darkened. It's the First Division Vice Captain. If he catches me snacking in the kitchen, my spotless reputation will be ruined. Yurei laughed. What reputation does a student have to ruin? How about this: beg me for help? If you can convince me, I'll lend you my spirit pressure concealing cloak. It's a divine treasure, after all. The condition is simple: after you graduate, join the 2nd Division. Deal. Kaelith frowned, debating whether to tarnish his image or sign himself over to the Shin family. Before he could decide, another voice echoed from outside. Lady Yurei. Are you here? If so, please respond. Yurei froze. Damn, it's Marekio. Why is he here? Marekio. Madame Marekio, head of the Mada family and the 2nd Division's vice captain. With him around, there's no way to escape using stealth techniques. As she spoke, Yurei pulled off her black cloak and covered both herself and Kaelith with it. Chapter 15. Wait, hold on a second. Before Kaelith Yurei could react, Yurei had already pulled him under her cloak. The cloak wasn't very large, and the two of them squeezed together tightly, reminiscent of the trio hiding under the invisibility cloak in Hogwarts. Despite her young appearance, Yurei's figure was surprisingly well developed. Even through the academy uniform, Kaelith could feel the warmth radiating from her. Kaelith's body stiffened awkwardly. Sensing his discomfort, Yurei grinned mischievously. "Oh my, is your face turning red? Ridiculous. I, Kaelith Yurei, aim to be the Soul Society's future playboy king. Blushing is something I left behind at 3 years old." He whispered a retort while subtly raising 2 fingers to trace an invisible line in the air before them. With the motion, a thin layer of spiritual energy unfolded, encasing them in a protective barrier. Seeing his actions, Yurei's eyes lit up with interest. As a member of the stealth force, she recognized his spell immediately, Bakut number 26, Kyoke, curved light, dot. Kyoko's effect was to bend light and create an invisible shield, perfectly hiding anything within its boundary. While rarely used in combat, it was a challenging technique to master. Yet Kaelith had performed it flawlessly, silently, and without incantation. Yurei grew more impressed the longer she observed him. A master of spiritual pressure detection, adept at stealth Kendo, and possessing an intriguingly flexible moral compass. This guy was practically born for the 2nd Division. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and Sōsuke appeared at the doorway. Kaelith swallowed nervously. All they'd done was sneak into the kitchen for a meal. It wasn't a big deal. And yet, he felt an inexplicable tension, like the kind one experiences in a horror game while hiding in a closet, watching a monster prowl nearby. Noticing Kaelith's unease, Yurei smirked teasingly. Kaelith rolled his eyes but said nothing. Moments later, a towering man walked in. He stood over 2 meters tall, sporting a brown pompadour, thick lips and a gaudy gold chain around his neck, exuding the aura of a nouveau riche thug. Scanning the room with a frown, the man muttered, "Strange. I could have sworn I saw the young lady head this way. Did she leave already?" Just as he finished speaking, his eyes sharpened, and he began walking toward where Kaelith and Yurei were hiding. Yurei tensed, her body coiling like a startled cat. Seeing her reaction, Kaelith suddenly relaxed. In fact, he found the situation oddly amusing, almost worth getting caught for. Truly, nothing brought more joy than watching someone else squirm. Noticing his smug expression, Yurei rolled her eyes. Under their watchful gaze, Madame Erekio strode to a table where an empty soup bowl lay. He reached out, touched the bowl's surface, and frowned deeply. The bowl's still warm. Someone was just here. Sōsuke blinked in surprise. The Shion family's young lady snuck into the 1st Division's kitchen for a meal. Mada hesitated, finding the idea absurd. Surely, a noble of Yurei's stature wouldn't stoop to sneaking around another division's kitchen. But then again, given her usual antics, it didn't seem entirely out of the question. After a brief discussion, the two decided to search the surrounding area immediately. Given the rebels' erratic activities and Yurei's esteemed status, it was far too dangerous for her to be wandering alone. Under the cloaked pair's silent observation, the 2 vice-captains exited the kitchen in a hurry. Once the coast was clear, Yurei exhaled a sigh of relief. Then, glaring at Kaelith, she grumbled, "This is all your fault. Now I've got a reputation for stealing food." Kaelith chuckled. "Well, I could always call them back and explain everything." "Ahem. No need for that," Yurei replied, instantly backing down. Watching her quick capitulation, Kaelith shook his head in amusement and raised his hand to remove the cloak. But just as he did, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. Synchronization detected with bound entity Sōsuke Aizen. New skills acquired. Synchronization complete. Your understanding of had has advanced. Skill acquired had number 31, Shaka. Your understanding of swordsmanship has improved. Your mastery of Shunpo has advanced. Your hand-to-hand combat skills have increased. Kaelith had grown used to these notifications over the past few days. Aizen's rapid growth was nothing short of terrifying. Despite still being a student, Aizen avoided typical leisure activities for someone his age. Every spare moment was spent either training or mentally dissecting Kendo techniques. With a rare combination of prodigious talent and monastic discipline, Aizen's progress never ceased to amaze. So, when these notifications appeared, Kaelith hardly reacted anymore. But this time, something unusual caught his attention. Skill acquired, Special Kendo Simulated Zero. Kaelith blinked, his confusion evident. Simulated Zero? What was Aizen up to? Why would he create such a technique? Was he already delving into the boundaries between Shinigami and Hollow? That couldn't be, could it? Something wrong. Yurei asked, noticing his hesitation. Kaelith turned to the dark-skinned girl crouched beside him and smirked. Nothing. I was just savoring the feeling of you pressing so tightly against me earlier. Hey! That's harassment. Yurei retorted, giving him a hard shove. Kaelith glanced at the black cloak in his hands and asked, Where did you get this cloak, anyway? Yurei chuckled. It's one of the many ancient artifacts preserved by the Shin'ō family, known as the stealth cloak. Not something made by someone you know. I wish I knew someone capable of crafting something like this. Yurei laughed, shaking her head. Kaelith nodded thoughtfully. After confirming that Mada and Sōsuke had left, the two climbed out of the kitchen. As they walked, Yurei turned to Kaelith and said, Kaelith, when you graduate, come join the 2nd Division. What's in it for me? Kaelith raised an eyebrow. Yurei considered for a moment. How about a direct promotion to seated officer? Kaelith shook his head. With my abilities, I could become a seated officer in any division. Fair enough. Yurei nodded. Then how about a personal chef? Whatever you want to eat, whenever you want it. Kaelith rubbed his chin. Tempting. I'll think about it. Seeing he was still hesitant, Yurei leaned in conspiratorially. Our division has plenty of adorable girls. One of them is so cute, even I feel a little smitten. If you join, I'll introduce you to her. Before she finished speaking, Kaelith had already grabbed her hand. Please, make sure to reserve me a spot. Chapter 16. Under the moonlight, Kaelith walked halfway across Siraidii, heading back to the Shin'ō Academy dormitory. After showing his passage from the 1st Division to the gatekeeper, the guard didn't hesitate to let him through. Putting away the pass, Kaelith couldn't help but feel a bit awestruck. The taste of authority was unexpectedly sweet. In the past, whenever he went to hang out in Rukanga if he stayed out past curfew, he'd always have to sneak back over the walls, never able to stroll in with such ease. Wearing a mischievous smile, Kaelith swaggered back into the dormitory, heading towards his room. As he neared his door, he spotted something unexpected. Aizen, dressed in plain, simple clothes, was coming from the other end of the hallway. When Aizen noticed Kaelith, he paused, looking a bit surprised. But then he casually said, What a coincidence. I just stepped out to use the restroom and happened to run into you on your way back. The Captain Commander's training must have been tough, considering you're only just now getting back. Kaelith gave a brief recount of the events from the night. Hearing about Kaelith's adventure, Aizen couldn't help but feel a bit impressed. As expected of Kaelith, he couldn't even attend a simple lesson with the 1st Division without stirring up some sort of trouble. Speaking of his training at the 1st Division, Aizen couldn't help but feel curious about what techniques the one hailed as the strongest Shinigami in 1,000 years would teach Kaelith. Although curious, he wouldn't pry. For any Shinigami, their abilities were their most valuable assets, something never to be casually shared with others. Even though he and Kaelith were friends, there was no reason to inquire into what exactly he'd learned. With that thought, Aizen prepared to head back to his room. But before he could take a step, Kaelith spoke up. Oh, right, Sōsuke, are you tired right now? If not, I could share some of what Captain Commander Yamamoto taught me tonight. Aizen turned his head, looking at Kaelith with a touch of surprise. What's wrong? Are you that tired? We can always go over it tomorrow, Kaelith said. Aizen frowned, replying, It's not a matter of being tired or not. Kaelith, do you realize what you're saying? Although I don't know exactly what the Captain Commander taught you, those lessons are valuable resources. Mastering techniques that other Shinigami don't know gives you the chance to progress faster, gain more resources, and secure greater opportunities. These are your assets. How could you just share them so freely? Hearing this, Kaelith's expression turned thoughtful. It's true. What I learned from the Captain Commander shouldn't just be handed out to others. Aizen nodded and was just about to leave. But Kaelith spoke up again, however, who are we to each other? Are we really just others? Aizen was momentarily stunned. Before he could respond, Kaelith was already heading off, saying, Come on, let's find a better spot. Here we'd risk disturbing others, plus we'd have to dodge the dorm supervisors. Let's go to the training hall, it's empty at night. Watching Kaelith, who had already set off on his own, Aizen's surprise shifted to confusion, then to quiet acceptance. He gently shook his head. Kaelith, this guy. I really don't understand him. Aizen let out a faintly exasperated smile, stepping forward to follow. Inside the training hall, Kaelith shared everything Captain Commander Yamamoto had taught him that day with Aizen. Hearing Yamamoto's improvements to the sword meditation, Aizen's expression turned thoughtful. After a minute or so, he nodded and said, as expected of the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13, this sword meditation technique not only helps awaken the Zanpakuto but more importantly, it allows one to familiarize themselves with controlling their spiritual pressure and emotions. Kaelith, you should practice this technique more. Even if it's not for the Zanpakuto, it will be extremely helpful for your future battles. Kaelith clicked his tongue. How did you end up learning old man Yamamoto's tricks? You're starting to sound like a nagging mother. Aizen. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Kaelith. Then, Kaelith, with a mysterious grin, said, instead of the sword meditation, old man Yamamoto also taught me a combat technique. He then repeated word for word, the technique Yamamoto had shared with him, which involved using sword pressure. After listening, Aizen stroked his chin. Using the Zanpakuto to alter the spiritual pressure's property to slash. For those whose Zanpakuto hasn't awakened yet, or for those whose Zanpakuto's abilities are not combat-related, this is quite useful. It's much more effective than simply releasing spiritual pressure. Who would have thought that the man with the strongest Kendo-type Zanpakuto in the Soul Society would specialize in such a technique? Quite surprising. Seeing Aizen muttering to himself, Kaelith waved his hand. Stop thinking about old man Yamamoto. So, what do you think, Sōsuke? Do you think you can learn this technique within a week? Aizen opened his mouth, instinctively about to say that he didn't have that kind of talent. But, just as the words were on the tip of his tongue, he suddenly remembered how Kaelith had eagerly shared what he had learned with him without holding back. After a few seconds of silence, he chuckled softly. Under Kaelith's expectant gaze, Aizen slowly spoke. A week? That's unnecessary. One day will be enough. Seeing the confident gleam in Aizen's eyes, Kaelith laughed. As expected, with Aizen's help, there was no task too difficult. With Yamamoto's learning challenge, there was no need to worry at all. If he were to learn sword pressure on his own, he would probably manage it in about a week, but it would take a lot of effort. At least in the first 4 or 5 days, he would lose all of his free time for extracurricular activities. But now, all he had to do was repeat the key points that Yamamoto had mentioned, and Aizen would synchronize with them. Kaelith couldn't help but feel a little moved. When you combined himself and Aizen together, it really was overflowing with talent. And Aizen, seeing Kaelith's genuine smile, couldn't help but smirk. As expected, just as he thought, Kaelith wouldn't even be surprised by such an outrageous statement. If things went as expected, this guy had probably already learned how to use sword pressure. Did he teach him these techniques because he was afraid that Aizen wouldn't be able to keep up with his pace of becoming stronger? With all this confidence, he shouldn't be shocked when Aizen eventually surpassed him. Looking at Kaelith, Aizen suddenly had a thought. By the way, didn't you want to learn how to hide your spiritual pressure? Now that we have some time, I can teach you. That night, in the swordsmanship dojo, the two young students exchanged techniques that even professional Shinigami would shy away from. The next afternoon, Kaelith received a system notification that he had learned how to use sword pressure. After mentally simulating the technique, he found a quiet place, drew his asachi, and casually slashed. A blue crescent-shaped wave of spiritual pressure shot out from the tip of his blade, crashing into a nearby dirt mound, and causing a cloud of dust to rise. After feeling the strength of the sword pressure, Kaelith couldn't help but click his tongue. As expected of Aizen, he perfected the technique in just a day, which was truly mind-boggling. However, despite being able to directly synchronize various abilities from Aizen, Kaelith didn't neglect his daily training. In fact, in order to better digest this hard-won power, his training intensity was even higher than before. Because he had pushed himself too hard that day, he woke up in the middle of the night, groggy from arm soreness. Slowly sitting up, he stretched, and realizing it was still dark, he prepared to lie back down. But just as he was about to do so, he suddenly noticed something strange. There seemed to be an issue with Aizen's bed. T/N What is he doing in Aizen's bed? Chapter 17. Kaelith rose from the bed and made his way over to Aizen's side, his gaze fixed on the boy lying there. Something felt off. The person in front of him didn't radiate Aizen's usual presence. T/N We got baited LOL. Glancing around to confirm that the other two roommates were still asleep, he reached out and gently touched the figure. Sure enough, a faint ripple of spirit energy emanated, and his fingertip passed right through Aizen. It was a fake, crafted using Kendo. For an average Shinigami, even one stronger than the current Aizen, it might have been impossible to notice the discrepancy. But Kaelith was far too familiar with Aizen. Any slight irregularity in his spirit pressure was something Kaelith could detect immediately. Realizing the person in bed wasn't Aizen, Kaelith stepped out for a stroll, trying to locate his friend's spirit pressure. After a thorough search, he discovered that Aizen's presence was nowhere to be found within Shin'ō Academy. What's that guy, Sōsuke, doing out of school at a time like this? Kaelith's expression turned puzzled. Recalling the original Bleach storyline, an unsettling feeling crept into his mind. Returning to his bed, he didn't immediately fall asleep. Instead, he half closed his eyes and began reviewing the lessons he'd recently learned from Yamamoto. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten that he sensed a familiar spirit pressure re-entering his perception range. Aizen's spirit pressure had been deliberately concealed. If Kaelith hadn't been paying full attention, he might have missed the faint traces entirely. Closing his eyes fully, he waited. Soon, soft footsteps approached the room. Aizen paused at the door, checking to ensure all three of his roommates were still asleep, before returning to his bed and swapping places with the Kendo-crafted substitute. This confirmed it for Kaelith. The night before, when he'd returned from the First Division, Aizen had also come back in casual civilian attire, similarly staying out all night for unexplained reasons. What had he been up to? Frowning, Kaelith drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Aizen acted as if nothing had happened, attending classes with Kaelith as usual. Kaelith, too, behaved as he normally would, carrying his characteristic air of laziness. Meanwhile, Yamada Sōsuke was so engrossed in his thick medical book that he seemed oblivious to the world around him. Even during lunch, he read while eating, his focus unbroken as if the apocalypse wouldn't make him look up. Among their group, however, the most significant change was in Shun. Typically calm and composed, with a gentle smile gracing his lips, Shun was visibly distracted today. He frequently furrowed his brow, lost in thought. At lunch, he nearly embarrassed himself by eating so absent-mindedly that he almost smeared food on his face. For someone raised with noble etiquette, such behavior was nothing short of a drastic deviation. Finally, as Shun reached to dip his chopsticks into his teacup for the second time, Kaelith couldn't hold back anymore. Hey, Shun-sensei, what's got you so worked up? Did you meet a girl in Rukanga, and now your family won't let you bring her home? Shun froze briefly, staring at Kaelith as though only now realizing someone had spoken to him. He gave a helpless chuckle. Of course not. As the heir of the Kukaki family, my marriage is something my father decides. The Kukaki clan would never allow personal feelings to interfere with family interests. Really? Kaelith looked unconvinced. Under his gaze, Shun fell silent for a while before finally speaking again, his tone heavier this time. Kaelith, I may not be here until the end of this semester. In the near future, I'll be applying for a special graduation exam to complete my studies early. Hearing this, not only Kaelith but also Aizen, who rarely showed surprise, and Sōsuke, who was buried in his book, looked up in unison. What's going on? Did something happen with your family? Sōsuke asked, frowning slightly. Shun nodded. Raising his hand, he formed a soundproof barrier of spirit energy around their table. The rebels have grown stronger again. Originally, under the combined pressure of my father and brother-in-law, the rebels were losing ground rapidly, nearly being pushed out of Siraidai entirely. But now, certain noble families who have remained in the shadows have suddenly unveiled new tactics. Many powerful Shinigami privately nurtured by these clans have appeared on the battlefield. My brother-in-law, while formidable, cannot be everywhere at once. To make matters worse, some of the previously neutral high-ranking officers within the Gotei 13 seem to have shifted to aiding the rebels. As things stand, the pressure on my father and brother-in-law is steadily increasing. If this continues, the head captain may be forced to intervene personally. And if it comes to that, the scale of this internal conflict will no longer be limited to small skirmishes. It will engulf all of Siraidai and, potentially, the entire Soul Society. Taking a deep breath, Shun continued, as the eldest son of the Kukaki family, I cannot sit idly by in school while my elders fight and bleed. I have to do something. Hearing this, Kaelith exchanged glances with his friends. When he first arrived in this world and heard about the internal strife within the Soul Society, he'd found it amusing. With someone as overwhelmingly powerful as Yamamoto holding the line, who could stir up trouble? Why not just find the rebel leader and have Yamamoto finish it with a single strike? Wouldn't that end the war instantly? But as time went on, Kaelith came to understand the complexities of the conflict. The rebels' backers were likely one of the 4 great noble clans. While Yamamoto was unmatched in strength, at the end of the day, he was the leader of the warrior class. When facing nobles, even someone like him couldn't act without restraint. Unless the nobles openly tore apart the fabric of Seireidii, threatening everything Yamamoto sought to protect, he would remain an observer in this noble-driven war. At the onset of the war, the Kukaki and Shine clans had attempted to end it through a vote among the nobles. But to Jinrei Kukaki's surprise, more than half of the noble votes opposed his proposal. It was then that he realized the depth of the conflict was far greater than anticipated. Most of what Kaelith knew came from rumors and speculation. If he asked Shun directly, the latter would likely share everything he knew. But doing so would drag Kaelith into the vortex of this conflict. Kaelith didn't want that, and neither did Shun. Seeing Kaelith's somber expression, Shun smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, Kaelith. I can take care of myself. You don't need to worry about me. I promise to end this war as quickly as possible and restore peace to the Soul Society." Looking at Shun's confident expression, Kaelith remained silent for a long time. Then, as though making a decision, he turned to Shun. "Just make sure you stay alive. If anything happens, I'll avenge you." Shun chuckled dryly. "Thanks. I think." Chapter 18. First Division, Sword Dojo. Yamamoto stood at the center of the spacious dojo, his back turned to the entrance. Hearing the sound of approaching footsteps, he spoke slowly, "How is your sword pressure training coming along?" Looking at Yamamoto, who appeared every bit the enigmatic master with his back to him, Kaelith Yurei gave him a disdainful glance. This old man, it's a pity he hasn't published a book titled The Art of Pretending to be Mysterious. However, remembering the reason he had come here today, Kaelith's expression quickly shifted into a smile. "Of course, I've mastered it. When the head captain himself gives an order, how could I not take it seriously?" Hearing this, Yamamoto slowly turned around. "Show me." Without hesitation, Kaelith drew his asachi and slashed the air in Yamamoto's direction. A crescent-shaped wave of blue sword pressure tore through the air, heading straight for Yamamoto. Watching the incoming wave, Yamamoto's eyes showed a trace of surprise. He extended a hand, catching the sword pressure mid-air. Zzzt. The strike, powerful enough to split through boulders, felt like cotton in Yamamoto's grasp, leaving not a single scratch. After gauging its strength, Yamamoto casually exerted a bit more pressure, shattering the wave into fragments that dissolved into the air. Looking at Kaelith, who still held his asachi, Yamamoto opened his mouth. After a few seconds, he finally said, "Not bad." Kaelith chuckled. "All thanks to the head captain's excellent guidance." Seeing his smug expression, Yamamoto felt a silent alarm go off in his mind. Something was off. This kid must want something from me. The reason for his quick judgment was simple. Back when Kiriko Shunsui caused trouble and needed help or forgiveness, he had the exact same expression as Kaelith did now. With heightened vigilance, Yamamoto began today's lesson. Today's focus was hand-to-hand combat, part of the Shinigami's 4 fundamental skills Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Ho, and Kid. Specifically, they were focusing on Hakuda. Kaelith showed genuine interest in this. Yamamoto's mastery of Hakuda had been fully displayed during the battle in the Karakura town arc. Faced with Wonder Weiss Margla, an errand car specifically created to seal Yamamoto's Zanpakuto, Yamamoto had used nothing but his fists to utterly destroy him. Though Wonder Weiss had no extraordinary abilities beyond suppressing Yamamoto's Zanpakuto, his defensive strength was undeniably Espada level. For Yamamoto's Hakuda to shatter an Espada's body in a single blow, it surpassed the strength of many captains' Zanpakuto. Of course, this comparison excluded a certain someone. For the next few hours, Yamamoto earnestly shared his understanding of Hakuda, teaching Kaelith everything he could. Meanwhile, Kaelith, rare as it was, adopted the demeanor of a diligent student, carefully absorbing every word. That's all for today. We'll continue next time. After what felt like an eternity, Yamamoto concluded. Hearing this, Kaelith blinked in surprise. Then, hurriedly raising his hand, he asked, "Wait, head captain. Don't you have a super powerful punch technique? One that can split mountains and seas? Aren't you going to teach that today? Yamamoto. It took him a moment to realize what Kaelith was referring to. Meeting Kaelith's expectant gaze, Yamamoto grumbled, with your current understanding of Hakuda, it's far too early to learn Ikotsu. Learning is a process of gradual accumulation. If you aim too high without a solid foundation, you'll only end up taking the wrong path. His beard bristling, Yamamoto launched into a lecture. Seeing the impending long-winded speech, Kaelith quickly raised his hand again. Then, head captain. If I can master everything you taught me within this week, can you teach me that punch technique next week? Yamamoto frowned slightly. While today's lesson focused on foundational techniques, foundational skills required time and repetition to truly internalize. Many swordsmanship prodigies spent years honing basic swings before moving on to techniques. Even though Kaelith was a genius, overconfidence was dangerous. After a pause, Yamamoto nodded. Fine. If you master everything I taught you within a week, I'll teach you Ikotsu. But if you fail, next week you'll be training under a waterfall. It was a calculated move to temper Kaelith's arrogance while he was still young, saving him trouble in the future. Kaelith agreed enthusiastically. As Yamamoto prepared to dismiss him, Kaelith raised his hand yet again. Head captain, are you busy right now? I have some extracurricular questions. I'm busy. If someone has an extremely powerful hypnosis ability that can't be countered by ordinary means, what would be the best way to resist it? T/N I love this guy. For a brief moment, Yamamoto seriously considered kicking Kaelith out of the dojo again. Still, the question intrigued him. Standing on the wooden floor of the dojo, he pondered for a while before answering. There are 3 methods. The first is the simplest: elevate your spirit pressure. All hypnosis techniques are fundamentally tied to spirit pressure. If your spirit pressure far surpasses your opponent's, you can forcibly break through their ability. The second method is to find a way to counter it. For instance, if the hypnosis relies on sound, you can use kid to block your hearing before the fight begins. If it's based on visual cues, disrupt your opponent's movements. If neither of those work, consider using items like potions or gadgets. I'm not particularly familiar with these, but the Department of Research and Development might have a solution. As for the third, Yamamoto narrowed his eyes. This method just occurred to me. 12th Division Captain Kiryu Hikifune has recently made significant advancements in artificial souls. If anyone could create a defensive mechanism against hypnosis, it would be her. Kaelith paused at the name. Kiryu Hikifune, it sounded familiar. Wasn't she a member of the Royal Guard in the future? So at this point, she hadn't been promoted yet and was still working within the Gotei 13? Though he wasn't sure of her current capabilities, if she eventually joined the Royal Guard, she must be quite skilled. Kaelith decided to make time to visit the 12th Division soon. With his 1st Division credentials, he could easily come up with an excuse to get in. Perfect plan. Head Captain, one last question. Do you have any tracking techniques? Something subtle, like leaving a mark to locate someone without being noticed. Yamamoto. First hypnosis, now tracking techniques. What on earth was this troublemaker planning? Squinting, Yamamoto prepared to kick Kaelith out when a voice suddenly called out from the entrance. For stuff like that, ask me. I'm the expert. Chapter 19. Hearing the voice, both Kaelith Yurei and Yamamoto turned toward the entrance of the dojo. There, a short-haired, dark-skinned girl exuding youthful energy walked in with a bright smile. Shine Yurei. Seeing the newcomer, Yamamoto furrowed his brows slightly. Under the gaze of both men, Yurei approached, her grin widening as she playfully patted Kaelith on the arm. You're acting distant, Kaelith. Don't forget, I'm from the Onmitsukid. Tracking and assassination are second nature to me. Kaelith's eyes lit up. That's right. How could I forget? Learning from a pretty girl is way better than studying with an old geezer. Yamamoto. A vein bulged on the head captain's forehead. Meanwhile, Yurei burst into laughter. Yamamoto's voice dropped a note, his tone serious. Kaelith Yurei, why have you suddenly decided to learn these techniques? If you can't provide a reasonable explanation, I won't overlook this. Kaelith hesitated briefly. Though their relationship had developed for various reasons in a short time, Yamamoto had genuinely helped him a lot. After a moment's thought, Kaelith decided to tell the truth. I have a friend who might soon face a critical life decision. I want to stay close and ensure he doesn't stray down the wrong path. That's why I need to learn tracking techniques to keep an eye on his situation. As Kaelith spoke, he could not help but feel a wave of emotion, deeply moved by his own unwavering devotion to the sacred bond of friendship. To prevent Aizen from becoming the universally despised, isolated figure of the future, Kaelith was really putting in the effort. Surely, if Yamamoto had any heart, he'd fully support such a noble cause. However, when Kaelith looked up, he found Yamamoto and Yurei simply staring at him. A few seconds later, Yurei chuckled. Kaelith, you'd better come up with a more convincing reason. If this friend you're talking about is actually yourself, I might believe you a little more. With your skill level, tracking a friend would be child's play. You don't need any special techniques for that. Next time you make up a reason, at least make it reasonable. Kaelith. What the? He turned to Yamamoto, hoping for some validation. But Yamamoto simply stared back silently. He even nodded at Yurei's reasoning. Seeing their reactions, Kaelith couldn't hold back anymore and burst out, "Fine. I've got my eye on a beautiful girl. I want to find out where she lives so I can passionately, relentlessly, and shamelessly pursue her. That's why I want to learn tracking techniques." Yurei blinked, then adopted a serious expression. "That's a very important matter. There's no time to waste." Kaelith. Yamamoto frowned slightly and reminded him, "You must not do anything that violates the law. Once you've confirmed her identity, inform me. I'll help you look into her background." Kaelith. T/N shame on them, for not recognizing Kaelith's selflessness. After bidding farewell to Yamamoto, Kaelith followed Yurei to the Shin'ō estate. As he stepped through the gates, he was greeted by an endless expanse of traditional Japanese-style buildings and gardens. The sheer grandeur left him feeling like a villager entering a magnificent palace. Seeing his reaction, Yurei smirked. "Well? What do you think?" Kaelith clicked his tongue. "Nothing worth thinking about. Just look at these houses. Every beam, every foundation stone, it all came from the sweat and toil of the common working folk. Nobles are truly despicable." Startled, Yurei's eyes widened. In the Soul Society, speaking ill of nobles was a grave offense. If overheard by the wrong person, the consequences could be dire. She was about to warn Kaelith when he continued with a sigh. "What's even worse is that I didn't get a single share of that exploitation." Yurei froze for a few seconds before bursting into laughter, finally understanding his meaning. For a moment, she'd thought Kaelith was one of those extreme noble haters. But upon reflection, she realized that if Kaelith truly despised nobles, how could he be friends with Shin'ō or seek her help so openly? Leaning in conspiratorially, Yurei grinned. "Do you want to become a noble? I might have a way." "What way?" Kaelith raised an eyebrow. With a sly chuckle, Yurei said, "Marry into the Shin'ō family. Then you'd be part of one of the 4 great noble clans. How does Shin'ō Kaelith sound? Pretty nice, right?" Kaelith looked thoughtful for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't mind the name change, but if I marry you, my grand plan to build a massive harem in the Soul Society will be ruined. So, I'll pass." Yurei. Though she'd been joking, she couldn't help but roll her eyes at Kaelith's ridiculous reasoning. The two of them reached an open area and sat down facing each other. Yurei extended her finger, using Reishi to draw diagrams in the air as she explained the tracking kid technique. "This kid is an improved technique I developed, combining Onmitsu secrets with Shin'ō family methods. As long as you're careful when setting it up, even Shinigami stronger than you will struggle to detect its presence. But keep in mind, to maintain its stealth, the technique has a limited duration. It only lasts about 3 hours before dissipating automatically." Kaelith listened attentively, far more focused than he ever was in Yamamoto's lectures. Yurei held nothing back, explaining every detail thoroughly. As Kaelith practiced, she pointed out his mistakes and offered targeted guidance. Before long, Kaelith had mastered the technique. While his raw talent wasn't at the level of Aizen's, his comprehension ability was no slouch. After all, if he were completely inept, he wouldn't have been able to rise to the top of his first-year class before synchronizing with Aizen. Seeing Kaelith master the technique, Yurei nodded in satisfaction. "To pick up this secret art so quickly, you're definitely suited for the Onmitsu. Kaelith stroked his chin. Or maybe I'm just quick at learning techniques across all fields. Caught off guard by his bluntness, Yurei chuckled out loud. Suddenly, Kaelith thought of something and asked, by the way, Yurei, you're familiar with the 12th Division, right? What kind of person is their captain? Yurei tilted her head, slightly puzzled. The 12th Division. Captain Hikifune? I don't have much interaction with them, but from what I've heard, she's straightforward and easygoing. Kaelith raised an eyebrow. He'd assumed Yurei would know more about the 12th Division, given that Sōsuke Aizen was transferred from the 2nd Division to the 12th. But then again, he wasn't entirely sure about the timeline. The past events of the Soul Society were such a mess that even the authors struggled to keep track, let alone expect a viewer to have it all figured out. After a moment of thought, he asked, "Do you know Sōsuke Aizen?" Yurei furrowed her brows, tilting her head as she pondered. A few seconds later, she let out an ah. Sōsuke Aizen? I've heard that name before. Before Captain Kairanji left, he left a list with the Shin family. It included names of promising newcomers he believed were worth observing and possibly promoting. That name was on the list. Chapter 20. Hearing Yurei's words, Kaelith Yurei was a bit surprised. According to her, Sōsuke Aizen hadn't yet achieved any prominent position within the 2nd Division, let alone transferred to the 12th Division. In other words, the current Sōsuke Aizen was like an untapped asset, much like a rare early investment with limitless potential. If Kaelith did him a few favors now, he'd gain Yurei's gratitude and a sense of obligation. Then, Kaelith could fully leverage Yurei's talents, pushing him to complete various research projects and inventions that would be of great use. Kaelith's demands weren't excessive, he simply wanted the technology and video game development in the modern world to advance by 2 centuries. With Yurei's capabilities, that shouldn't be too much to ask, right? Imagining the bright future ahead, Kaelith couldn't help but smile. Yurei noticed Kaelith's expression and gave him a puzzled look. Sōsuke Aizen. From the name, he must be a man. Was he one of those types with such a cute, androgynous look? Kaelith really did have broad tastes. A trace of admiration sparked in Yurei's heart. Suk. At the sound of Kaelith's shout, several people in the cafeteria instinctively glanced toward Aizen, who was sitting in the corner. Aizen sighed, placing a hand on his forehead. He disliked unnecessary attention, and Kaelith seemed to check many of his least favorite boxes. With a helpless look, Aizen watched as Kaelith sped across half the cafeteria and took a seat beside him. Seeing Aizen eating alone, Kaelith asked curiously, "Where are Kukaki-shun and Synopsis Yamada? Kukaki hasn't been at school all day, so I'm not sure where he went." Yamada Synopsis is back in the dorms, focusing on his studies. He even asked a friend to bring him his meal. Hearing this, Kaelith frowned. Shun Kukaki's personality wouldn't allow him to skip class without reason. He'd have to ask Sensei Kinoshita about it later, maybe he knew something. After getting his meal, Kaelith sat down across from Aizen and began recounting the hand-to-hand techniques he'd learned from Captain Commander Yamamoto earlier that day. At first, Aizen listened calmly while eating. But soon, a hint of surprise crossed his face. Impressive. As expected of Captain Commander Yamamoto. His technique seamlessly integrates spirit pressure into physical movements, creating explosive power with each strike. With these foundational techniques, one could develop moves that, while appearing simple on the surface, could rival even some kid spells in power. Hearing Aizen's analysis, Kaelith's eyes widened. Unlike Kaelith, who was a transmigrator, Aizen had no prior knowledge of Yamamoto's famous Ikkotsu, one bone, technique. Yet, based solely on the basic training Kaelith described, Aizen had deduced most of its effects. Was this guy truly a fellow student or some ancient genius reborn? While Kaelith was astonished, Aizen had already begun considering ways to apply the technique. After a moment, he asked, "Kaelith, how much of this technique have you mastered?" Kaelith held his bowl of soup, replying, "I just started today. How much could I possibly know?" "Perfect, then eat up. When you're done, let's spar and test it out." The hand-to-hand combat training Kaelith had brought back piqued Aizen's interest. After their meal, they headed to the dojo, changed into training uniforms, and began practicing Yamamoto's techniques. At first, Aizen struggled a bit, his spirit pressure not entirely in sync with his movements. But within less than half an hour, he began to get the hang of it. Ha! Aizen took a sudden step forward, fist clenched at his waist, and launched a punch. Though the motion wasn't particularly fast, Kaelith felt a massive pressure emanating from it, like facing a formidable beast. He raised his arms, condensing spirit pressure into a shield. Ducking the punch would have been easy, but he was curious to see its effect. Boom! The impact nearly made Kaelith's eyes pop out. At first glance, Aizen's punch seemed ordinary, something any martial artist might execute. But the moment his fist connected with Kaelith's forearm, a terrifying surge of spirit pressure burst forth, piercing through Kaelith's shield and penetrating his arm. If not for Kaelith's deep reserves of spirit pressure, this punch might have had him spitting out his dinner. Aizen looked at his hand, equally surprised by the result. Yamamoto had only taught Kaelith the basic training method, without explaining its advanced applications. This punch was something Aizen had devised on his own, using Yamamoto's foundation. He hadn't expected it to be this powerful. Realizing Kaelith's state, Aizen quickly approached. "Kaelith, are you all right?" "I'm fine, it's nothing serious," Kaelith replied, flexing his wrist with a wry smile. He now looked at Aizen as if staring at some kind of monster. It wasn't the punch's sheer force that shocked him, but the fact that Aizen had managed to trigger a system prompt with that strike. System notification, binding detected. Sōsuke Aizen has acquired a new skill automatically syncing. Sync complete. You've advanced your understanding of hand-to-hand combat and mastered the secret technique Ikotsu, one bone. This abnormal guy had actually managed to replicate Yamamoto Genrisai's signature move, Ikotsu, by using basic training and sheer intuition. Outrageous. Seeing Kaelith was fine, Aizen sighed in relief. With a slight smile, he said, "That move just came to me out of nowhere. I'll explain the principles behind it, and you can try it yourself." Kaelith shook his head. "No need. I already understand it." Aizen blinked in surprise. "Are you sure? That technique goes beyond just a punch and a release of spirit pressure. How about a test?" Kaelith replied, grinning mischievously. Aizen felt a foreboding sense of curiosity but couldn't believe Kaelith had grasped the move he'd only just discovered. He nodded, assuming a defensive stance, signaling Kaelith to attack. Kaelith chuckled, taking a deep breath. Unlike Aizen's experimental punch, Kaelith's was executed with full confidence. Ikotsu. Aizen's pupils constricted as Kaelith's fist drew near. In the next instant, it felt as if a freight truck had hit him head-on, sending him flying back uncontrollably.
Thanks for listening.